Once upon a time, there existed a sacred text deemed so divine that congregations recited it in their places of worship directly beside the four Gospels, and yet it was simultaneously considered so perilous that religious authorities ultimately prohibited it completely. We're talking about the Apocalypse of Peter. At one time, this was revered scripture for innumerable followers of Christ, spoken aloud together with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as genuine holy writing across multiple generations. Then, however, an event occurred that concealed this document for more than 10 centuries. In this video, we're going to explore every single aspect of this banned religious text and disclose precisely what made the ancient church so afraid of it that they attempted to remove it entirely from recorded history. But before we jump in, for those of you who are new around here, think about tapping that like button and hitting subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And let us know your location and what time it happens to be where you are. We're creating a worldwide community right here, which means you can connect with others who think like you from across the globe in the comment area below. So with that said, let's get started, okay? The Finding in the Wasteland. December of 1945. Arid winds carry murmurs throughout the Egyptian wasteland, close to Nag Hammadi. A man named Muhammad Ali Al-San searches for soil nutrients underneath towering limestone formations. His farming tool connects with something solid, pottery, very old pottery. An ancient vessel surfaces from generations' worth of desert sand. Muhammad Ali pauses for a moment. Stories from the area tell of supernatural beings sealed inside containers, yet financial hardship gives courage to desperate individuals. He brings his implement down with force. The pottery container breaks apart. 13 volumes wrapped in leather tumble out into the daylight. Pages of papyrus move in the breeze like wounded creatures. The farmer from the countryside collects whatever he's able to transport. These mysterious symbols could perhaps be sold for money at the trading post. He lacks the ability to interpret these characters. He has no way of knowing that he possesses pieces of Christianity that had been forgotten. Within these documents rests a prophecy so horrifying that the fathers of the early church shuddered at even speaking its name. The Apocalypse of Peter. These volumes pass through underground market traders. Academic researchers hear rumors of what has been unearthed. Urgent messages travel between Cairo and universities throughout Europe. The world of scholarship becomes electrified with anticipation. Documents from antiquity emerge infrequently. Whenever they appear, they alter our understanding of the past. A professor named Togoina obtains multiple texts. He creates photographic records of the pages before they disappear once more into the hands of private collectors. These photographs show Coptic writing. Underneath the translation exists something even more ancient, original Greek versions from the 2nd century of the Common Era. At the same time, additional pieces emerge in other locations. The Aime manuscript has resided in a French museum collection since the year 1886. Researchers had previously considered it without significance. At this point, they examine it once again. The fragments start to create a coherent image. This specific apocalypse carries the name of Peter, the very same Peter who turned his back on Christ on 3 separate occasions. The fisherman who stepped out onto the water's surface before losing faith and beginning to sink. What reason would anyone have for attributing such powerful visions to him? The explanation lies waiting within the translated text. Each phrase uncovers a form of Christianity remarkably distinct from contemporary religious institutions. In this version, heavenly justice functions with exacting precision. Every transgression is met with its ideal form of retribution. Every cruel deed discovers its reflection throughout eternity. The Egyptian sun bears down heavily upon the excavation locations. Archaeological teams work with urgency. The political situation in the region becomes increasingly volatile. Scholars from foreign nations encounter growing distrust. The window of opportunity for adequate research narrows rapidly. Numerous texts vanish before translation work can even commence. However, sufficient material remains, enough to uncover an entrance that Christianity in its early form decided to seal shut. The Apocalypse of Peter reveals to us what those who believed once embraced as reality, what they spoke out loud during their communal worship, what they discussed in hushed tones filled with fearful amazement. The desert releases its hidden knowledge with great resistance. Every single fragment of papyrus disintegrates when barely touched. Researchers operate using precision tools and optical magnification devices. They capture images of every written line before the fibers from ancient times dissolve back into particles. Contemporary Egypt appears worlds away from the Alexandria of antiquity. Nevertheless, these writings create a bridge across that distance. They transmit the perspectives of believers who assembled in homes for worship in secrecy, where they argued over which books contained heavenly authority, where they determined what those in future generations would come to accept as truth. The Apocalypse of Peter rises up from this storm of historical dust, a prophetic vision so thorough, so elaborate in its accounting of morality, that it very nearly became part of the New Testament, very nearly transformed into scripture that countless billions would commit to memory. Rather than that, it disappeared from view. Leaders of the church became increasingly uneasy with its explicit imagery. They favored approaches to divine judgment that were more indirect. The document gradually faded from collective memory. Only scattered pieces remained concealed beneath the desert sands until Muhammad Ali's digging tool transformed everything. His search for fertilizing material restored forgotten Christianity back into the light of day. That pottery vessel contained far more than simply ancient volumes. It held within it different directions that believers in the early days regarded as holy. Each new translation brings to light fresh terrors, fresh understanding of what caused ancient minds such dread. The consequences described go beyond what can be imagined. They operate according to reasoning that appears both strange and recognizable. Flawless justice delivered through flawless agony. This discovery shakes the foundational beliefs of scholars. Christianity turns out to be far less uniform than had been previously assumed. Competing gospels fought for recognition. Different apocalyptic texts presented varying prophecies of the final days. Authorities within the church made deliberate selections regarding which perspectives would endure. These selections determined the shape of everything that came afterward. They established what those who believe in modern times would study, what they would regard as plausible, what they would receive as divine reality. The Apocalypse of Peter stands for the direction that was never followed, the version of Christianity that could have developed. Its rediscovery creates questions that historians of the church would rather leave unaddressed. Questions surrounding authority, the process of canonization, and the forces of power that gave shape to religious doctrine. The desert winds continue their movement across Nagamadi to this very day. Visitors to the area arrive now. They photograph the limestone cliff faces and try to envision ancient mysteries. The majority have absolutely no awareness of what was discovered in this place. No awareness of how near this text came to altering the course of everything. The door that was forbidden now stands open one more time. On the other side waits a vision of divine judgment so exact, so completely unrelenting, that Christians in the early period both accepted it and feared it at the same time. The Apocalypse of Peter has emerged once again from beneath the sand. Its declaration resonates through the passage of centuries, raising the question of why such comprehensive moral bookkeeping once appeared essential. What compelled believers to construct mental images of punishment so detailed? What caused them to organize transgressions with such surgical exactness? The responses exist within the text itself, within Peter's peculiar passage through domains of absolute justice and dreadful outcome. The peculiar vision of Peter. The prophetic experience starts without fanfare. Peter is seated alongside Jesus on the Mount of Olives. The disciples press in closely, questioning him about the conclusion of time. Which indications will announce the ultimate judgment? In what way will those who are righteous recognize that their moment has arrived? Jesus answers using prophecy. Armed conflicts will increase in number. Teachers spreading falsehood will lead many astray. The sun will grow dark, and the moon will leak crimson. At that moment comes the instant that alters everything completely. Peter's state of awareness undergoes a transformation. The fabric of reality warps in the space around him. He discovers himself positioned in a location existing between different worlds, not entirely of the earth, and not entirely belonging to the divine realm. Illumination pours forth from all directions and from no specific source. The atmosphere itself appears to be living and filled with holy presence. Peter's mortal vision fights to make sense of what enters his sight. Stretching out before him lies an enormous expanse, separated by a massive divide. On the near side, flowering gardens flourish in perpetual springtime. Pleasant aromas move through the air on gentle currents. Ribbons of transparent water curve their way among trees in bloom. The deceased who lived righteously move about wearing garments of absolute light. Their expressions radiate with complete tranquility. However, Peter's attention gets pulled toward the opposite side. Over there, within a domain of darkness and fire, he becomes witness to something that will disturb Christian mental imagery for hundreds of years to come. The correction of those who lived wickedly reveals itself with frightening exactitude. Every person who sinned is given correction, specifically designed for their earthly offenses. Those who spoke lies dangle, suspended by their tongues above containers of metal in a boiling state. People who delivered testimony they knew to be false discover their mouths becoming filled with flames that never fully destroy. The fire delivers unending torment without offering the kindness of complete annihilation. Merchants driven by greed who deceived others using incorrect weights and measurements find themselves submerged in basins of liquefied gold. The precious metal they chased during their lifetime now encloses them entirely. They extend their arms toward the top, but are unable to rise upward. Their hands dissolve and reconstruct themselves in never-ending repetitions of pointless reaching. Women who decorated themselves for the purpose of attracting husbands belonging to other women hang suspended by their hair above bottomless pits of flame. The makeup they once put on with self-admiration now scorches their faces for all time. Physical attractiveness becomes horror. The power to draw others converts into revulsion. Men who engaged in relations that were forbidden discover themselves forced into humiliating physical contact with one another, incapable of pulling apart, incapable of discovering fulfillment. Their longings transform into their place of confinement. What they pursued in hidden places now establishes their condition throughout eternity. Those individuals who brought harm to children endure consequences that go beyond what can be put into words. Their sufferings reflect the purity they destroyed. The suffering they caused comes back to them increased beyond human ability to understand. Heavenly justice guarantees complete equilibrium. Those who committed murder go through death over and over again. They plummet from tremendous heights, experiencing every bone breaking into pieces, and then instantly reform their bodies to plummet once more. Every collision delivers total consciousness of their victims' dying moments. The capacity to feel what others felt becomes their perpetual anguish. Peter observes with increasing dread. The exactness leaves him astounded. Every offense discovers its flawless reflection in the form of punishment. Heavenly record-keeping functions with the certainty of mathematics. Not a single detail goes unnoticed. Not a single wrongdoing is left without response. And yet, the prophetic vision holds mercy in addition to judgment. Young ones who passed away before attaining moral understanding frolic in open fields of summer without end. The sound of their joy echoes across the separation, a signal that purity receives shelter even in territories of absolute justice. Celestial beings travel among the various punishments, not for the purpose of offering relief, but to guarantee precision. They calculate each torment in relation to the transgression that produced it. They modify severity to correspond with moral significance. Their expressions reveal no feeling, solely commitment to heavenly exactness. The deceased who were righteous observe their equivalents in anguish, yet experience no compassion. Their purification encompasses correct emotional reactions to heavenly justice. They comprehend that mercy in the absence of responsibility weakens the foundation of moral structure. They perceive magnificence in the dreadful balance. Flowing channels of fire create divisions between distinct classifications of those who sinned. Every stream produces heat at levels appropriate to particular offenses. People who stole from women without husbands and children without parents discover themselves within flames less intense than those who led entire communities into corruption through dishonest instruction. The temperature never brings destruction, yet it continually provides lessons. Peter comes to understand that he is observing not random acts of brutality, but instructional results. Every form of punishment conveys what the person who sinned did not succeed in learning while alive. Suffering transforms into educational material. Anguish becomes converted into comprehension, even though comprehension arrives too late for any possibility of transformation. The vision undergoes a shift. Peter perceives how actions taken on earth generate destinies that last forever. Every decision carves pathways that establish ultimate locations. The exercise of free will happens continuously, yet its outcomes build up past the point of reversibility. The instant of death merely makes visible what individual souls have transformed into. Celestial beings escort Peter throughout regions where varying categories of moral corruption are given their correction. He takes note of the layout of judgment, how divine justice arranges itself in accordance with ethical classifications, how the punishment corresponds to the offense with the precision of artistry. The guided tour proceeds through sections set aside for those who practiced religious deception. Individuals who instructed others in virtue while engaging in depravity discover themselves subjected to complex tortures that reveal their concealed inconsistencies. Their faces shown to the public melt away, making visible the moral decay underneath. Reality becomes something from which there is no escape. Prophets who spoke falsely and directed believers down wrong paths encounter especially inventive forms of correction. They go through the hopelessness that their deceptions created in other people. They experience the state of confusion, the faith that was lost, the spiritual harm multiplied throughout all those they victimized. Their sphere of influence transforms into their source of pain. Yet Peter also perceives the benefits that lie in wait for souls who remained faithful. Gardens where those who are righteous spend time walking alongside the patriarchs and prophets of old. Dining areas arranged with nourishment that feeds without producing a feeling of being overly full. Exchanges of ideas that extend throughout eternity without running out of topics to explore. The vision exceeds Peter's human ability to fully grasp. He finds it difficult to process the extent of divine justice, the thorough documentation of every moral decision, the flawless equilibrium between offense and result, the frightening magnificence of a cosmos where nothing goes unobserved. When the vision starts to diminish, Peter discovers himself once again on earthly terrain. However, the mental pictures stay seared into his recollection. The comprehensive chart of eternity's moral landscape, the evidence that every single action carries infinite importance, the disclosure that divine justice functions with precision beyond imagination. This prophetic vision will motivate him to communicate what he has witnessed, to provide warning to others regarding the reckoning that lies ahead, to portray the consequences and benefits with unflinching precision, even with the knowledge that such vivid moral imagery will create disturbance in equal measure to the instruction it provides. Understanding the apocalypse of Peter. The Apocalypse of Peter exists as part of an unusual collection of documents from ancient times. These writings make the claim that they unveil what is to come through visions from the divine. However, this specific apocalypse crosses boundaries that other writings approach with greater caution. In places where the book of Revelation communicates through symbols, the vision belonging to Peter offers descriptions that are graphically detailed. In places where alternative apocalypses suggest the existence of punishment, this document furnishes complete plans. The text adheres to recognizable structures. A figure who has been selected is given heavenly disclosure. That individual communicates what they have observed. The disclosure centers on the ultimate fate awaiting humanity. Yet Peter's apocalypse departs from traditional patterns in its merciless specificity. The majority of apocalyptic writing employs language that is symbolic. Creatures represent kingdoms and empires. Numerical values contain meanings that are concealed. Mental pictures call for interpretation. The Apocalypse of Peter shows preference for straightforward portrayal. People who have sinned are suspended by their tongues. Liquefied gold pours over traders motivated by greed. Hair is transformed into binding rope for those consumed with vanity. This approach of taking things literally distinguishes it from the canonical book of Revelation. The vision experienced by John develops with mythological scale. Serpentine dragons and mounted riders control battles of cosmic proportion. The imagery functions on numerous levels, permitting different ways of understanding. The vision belonging to Peter allows no such adaptability. The document most likely came into existence during the 2nd century. Christians in the early period were still in the process of deciding which books merited recognition as authoritative. Numerous gospels moved from place to place among those who believed. Different letters made claims of having been written by apostles. Various apocalyptic texts competed for recognition as heavenly disclosure. The name of Peter holds considerable influence in this struggle for acceptance. Among the 12 disciples, he maintained the closest position to Jesus. His standing as an authority figure could provide validation for any document carrying his name. However, those who study these matters express doubt that the Peter of history actually composed this apocalypse. The manner of Greek composition points toward creation at a later time. The person who wrote it possessed understanding of Christian worries regarding moral responsibility. Those who believed in the early period experienced concern about heavenly justice. In what manner would God separate the righteous from those who were wicked? Which standards would be put into effect? In what way would punishment correspond appropriately to offense? The Apocalypse of Peter supplies thorough responses. This document functions as instruction in morality, presented in the disguise of prophetic vision. Every form of punishment conveys particular lessons regarding conduct that is forbidden. Those who read gain knowledge, not merely of what to stay away from, but the reasons why staying away holds importance. The outcomes seem far too dreadful to take any chances. This purpose of education provides explanation for the document's widespread appeal among Christians in the early period. Leaders within the church recited it out loud during times of worship. Those who believed committed its portrayals of divine justice to memory. The powerful imagery strengthened teaching regarding moral conduct. Fear transformed into educational curriculum. However, the same powerful imagery that rendered it beneficial also rendered it troublesome. As Christianity created theology that was more advanced, the unsophisticated literal interpretation appeared unsuitable. Divine justice merited handling with greater subtlety. The descriptions that were graphic seemed to reduce rather than elevate religious comprehension. The Apocalypse of Peter additionally brings up questions regarding divine compassion. The consequences that are described appear to extend forever. No option for being saved presents itself. Once judgment is delivered, the results become fixed in place. This comes into conflict with the emerging concepts regarding divine willingness to forgive. Christian thinking at a later time would create more careful balance between justice and mercy. The realm of punishment might possess reality, but the gates of heaven remained accessible for those who repented. Divine love possessed the power to triumph over human shortcomings. The Apocalypse of Peter provides no such reassurance. The universe it presents functions through rigid, moral bookkeeping. The document makes visible how Christians in the early period formed mental pictures of existence after death before religious doctrine became standardized. They held expectations of punishments that were literal for transgressions that were specific. They maintained belief that divine justice would function as a mirror of legal systems on earth. They operated under the assumption that categories of morality would convert in a direct manner into results that last for eternity. This theology, in its primitive form, fulfilled significant purposes. It supplied guidelines for behavior that were clear. It gave assurance to believers that wrongdoing would, in the end, receive correction. It made the promise that hardship would find balance through rewards that were fitting. It rendered divine governance, something that human minds could comprehend. However, as Christianity reached greater maturity, such uncomplicated formulations turned problematic. Theologians created more intricate comprehension of the nature of humanity. They came to recognize that transgression involved more than simply outward conduct. They perceived transformation of the spirit as carrying greater importance than adherence to regulations. The Apocalypse of Peter stands for Christianity during its phase of development as an adolescent, possessing sufficient confidence to put forward bold declarations regarding divine reality, not yet possessing sufficient sophistication to raise questions about the implications of those declarations. The document reveals to us those who believed as they wrestled with essential questions regarding moral structure. The category it belongs to positions it among writings that make attempts to chart the world that cannot be seen. These documents make efforts to portray what exists past human experience. They make claims to authority by means of heavenly disclosure. They offer promises to provide responses to questions that pure philosophy lacks the ability to settle. The imagination that is apocalyptic fulfills psychological requirements that reason by itself cannot bring satisfaction to. People desire to possess knowledge that moral decisions carry ultimate significance. They require confidence that justice will achieve victory in the end. They pursue thorough clarifications of the manner in which divine governance functions. The Apocalypse of Peter provides nourishment for this hunger with a level of detail that has no precedent. It supplies complete charts of moral outcome. It portrays divine justice with the precision found in science. It delivers the promise that every action is met with a response that is perfect. Such all-encompassing responses prove impossible to resist for minds filled with anxiety. And yet, the same thoroughness that creates attraction also creates repulsion. The consequences described surpass human ability to inflict cruelty. The categories of morality appear random and shaped by specific cultures. The divine justice comes across as operating like a machine rather than being personal. The vision brings satisfaction to curiosity of the intellect, while creating disturbance in sensibilities of the spirit. This state of tension provides explanation for the complicated history of how the text was received. Christians in the early period embraced the clarity of its morality, while raising questions about what it suggested regarding theology. Leaders of the Church recognized value in its power to instruct, while experiencing worry regarding its unsophisticated materialism. The Apocalypse fulfilled purposes that were useful, while simultaneously generating questions that created discomfort. The Apocalypse of Peter exists as a lasting monument to the moral imagination of Christianity in its early form. It reveals to us those who believed as they made attempts to comprehend divine justice in the absence of theological vocabulary that was adequate. It makes visible the intense desire for knowledge with great detail regarding ultimate reality. It provides demonstration of how vividly minds focused on religion can form pictures of worlds that cannot be seen. Yet, it also reveals the restrictions of methods that are purely descriptive in their approach to truth that is spiritual. Certain mysteries push back against detailed clarification. Certain realities exist beyond human classifications. Certain questions call for faith rather than possession of knowledge. The Apocalypse of Peter makes the attempt to create charts of territories that might be more appropriately left without exploration, the canon that existed in shadow. Christianity in its early period possessed no official list for reading. No authority positioned at the center made decisions regarding which books were to be counted as scripture. No group of officials assembled to create boundaries for what would be canonical. Rather than that, hundreds of documents competed for recognition throughout communities that were scattered. The process bore more resemblance to biological evolution than to the creation of laws. Communities of believers in Rome studied different books than communities in Alexandria. That's right. Syrian followers of Christ showed preference for certain Gospels, while their counterparts in Egypt favored alternative ones. Every community created its own assembly of texts that carried authority. Unity would arrive at a later time, imposed from positions of power above rather than developing from the foundation upward. The Apocalypse of Peter experienced success in this environment of disorder. Numerous Christians in the early period regarded it as genuine writing from an apostle. They positioned it in the company of Gospels and letters that would in time constitute the New Testament. Certain communities assigned it greater value than texts we in the present regard as canonical. The Muratorian fragment, with a date from approximately 200 of the Common Era, provides a list of books recognized by Christians in Rome. It contains the Apocalypse of Peter, yet includes the notation that certain believers declined to have it spoken aloud in church. Even support in the early period arrived with expressions of hesitation. The content of the text that was graphic created disturbance for consciences that were sensitive. Leaders within the church encountered difficulties of a practical nature with material so vivid. In what manner do you recite portrayals of torment that lasts forever to gatherings that include diverse people? In what manner do you provide explanation for justice from the divine that appears to go beyond mercy from the divine? In what manner do you sustain care that is pastoral while delivering sermons regarding punishments that inspire terror? These worries became more urgent as Christianity obtained respectability in society. The conversion of Constantine delivered fresh challenges. The faith required the ability to create appeal to Romans with education who had become accustomed to sophistication in philosophy. Literal interpretation, without refinement regarding divine vengeance, appeared unsuitable for religion at the imperial level. In the meantime, alternative texts presented options that were more acceptable to the palate. The Gospel, according to John, supplied depths of mystical understanding in the absence of violence that was graphic. The letters from Paul investigated complexity of theology while maintaining sensitivity that was pastoral. The Book of Revelation that became canonical created balance between judgment and hope for being restored. Yet the Apocalypse of Peter retained those who defended it with passion. Clement, who came from Alexandria and stood as one among the most significant scholars of Christianity in its early form, made quotations from it as scripture that was authentic. He perceived no state of conflict between the intensity of its morality and theology belonging to Christianity. Numerous believers held the same confidence in the authority of the text. The debate makes visible tensions that ran deeper within Christianity as it underwent development. Should divine justice direct its focus toward punishment or toward restoration? Should writing that is apocalyptic create fear or provide encouragement? Should authority in religion place emphasis on fear or on love? Varying responses produced varying selections regarding what would be canonical. Geography exerted significant influence on these determinations. Churches in the eastern regions demonstrated greater receptiveness to writing that was apocalyptic than those in western locations. Followers of Christ in Syria and Ethiopia kept in preservation texts that those in Rome turned away. Factors related to culture gave shape to preferences in theology to a greater degree than considerations that were purely doctrinal. The Apocalypse of Peter experienced survival for the longest period of time in communities that assigned value to instruction in morality over sophistication in theology. Churches in rural areas discovered that its messages with clarity regarding divine justice held greater usefulness than discussions that were abstract regarding the nature of the divine. Those who believed with simplicity felt appreciation for its direct method of approaching questions that were complex. However, those with intellectual orientation living in urban areas experienced increasing discomfort with the theology of the text that was primitive. They created comprehension that was more filled with nuance regarding the nature of humanity and justice from the divine. The method of the apocalypse that was mechanical in its approach to accounting for morality appeared beneath the philosophy of Christianity that was emerging. Factors related to economics also exerted influence on decisions regarding canonization. Material made from papyrus required expenditure of money. Those who copied texts by hand required compensation through payment. Communities faced the necessity of making selections regarding which texts merited the effort of copying and the work of preservation. Texts that were popular managed to survive, while those existing at the margins disappeared from view. The Apocalypse of Peter, in a gradual manner, lost ground within this environment of competition. Pressures related to politics caused acceleration of the process of separating wheat from chaff. Leaders within the church required doctrine that was unified in order to sustain coherence within institutions. An excessive number of texts in competition generated states of confusion and separation. Boundaries that were canonical provided assistance in creating authority that was ecclesiastical and consistency in theology. The council held in Nika during 325 of the Common Era took up disputes regarding doctrine, yet stayed away from questions regarding canonization. That labor fell to authorities at a later time, such as Athanasius from Alexandria, whose letters sent out every year provided lists of books that had received approval for utilization by the Church. His letter sent during Easter in the year 367 of the Common Era in an effective manner created the canon of the New Testament as it now exists. The Apocalypse of Peter failed to make the selection that was final. The descriptions it contained that were graphic regarding punishment from the divine appeared unable to coexist with the emphasis Christianity was developing on love from the divine and mercy. Leaders within the church demonstrated preference for texts that generated balance between judgment and hope for the possibility of redemption. However, being left out of the canon did not produce disappearance that happened immediately. Numerous followers of Christ continued the practice of reading the Apocalypse in private. Monasteries kept copies in preservation in the company of other texts that were not canonical. The book sustained existence that was underground, even following the loss of recognition that was official. Christians, during medieval times on occasion, rediscovered the text and experienced wonder regarding why generations before them had turned it away. The clarity of its morality created appeal for those seeking reform, who pursued the goal of bringing back to life the intensity of Christianity in its primitive form. Yet authorities within the church with consistency discouraged interest of such nature. The canon that existed in shadow makes visible directions that Christianity in its early form made the choice not to pursue. Gospels that were alternative and placed emphasis on aspects of the teaching of Jesus that were different. Letters that took up concerns that the ones deemed canonical passed over in silence. Apocalypses that provided description of divine justice with levels of mercy that varied. These texts that were rejected reveal to us what those who believed in the early period regarded as falling within the realm of possibility. They make visible the spectrum of options that were available before. Boundaries of doctrine underwent hardening. They supply demonstration of how differently Christianity could have undergone development under circumstances that were different. The Apocalypse of Peter stands for one such direction that was alternative. A version of Christianity holding greater concern with bookkeeping regarding morality than with sophistication in theology. A faith that assigned value to knowledge with detail regarding divine justice, positioned above humble reception of mystery from the divine. A system of religion that demonstrated preference for fear over comfort as the source of motivation for conduct that was righteous. The rejection of it transmits signals regarding the choice Christianity made of certain values positioned above others. Compassion positioned above justice, hope positioned above fear, sophistication in theology positioned above simplicity in morality. These selections gave shape to the entirety of what came after, establishing determinations regarding what millions upon millions would come to hold as belief regarding the nature of the divine and the fate of humanity. And yet, the canon that existed in shadow maintains its haunting presence within consciousness belonging to Christianity. Texts that were rejected come to the surface with regularity, bringing to the fore questions regarding roads that were never traveled. They place believers under compulsion to face directly the nature of their doctrine that is contingent. They deliver reminders to us that voices belonging to others once put forward claims to authority that was equal. The Apocalypse of Peter exists as a lasting monument to this version of Christianity that was alternative. The descriptions it contains that are vivid regarding justice from the divine keep in preservation, imagination regarding morality. That doctrine, holding official status, made the choice to push down. The bookkeeping it provides with detail regarding wrongdoing and consequence makes visible anxieties that texts deemed canonical take up with greater subtlety. Developing comprehension of the canon that existed in shadow provides assistance to us in gaining appreciation for how extraordinary the process of canonization truly was. Christians in the early period made selections that would exert influence on billions of those who would believe in the future. They reached determinations regarding which voices would receive the opportunity to be heard and which would descend into silence. They gave shape not merely to doctrine, but to the comprehension held by entire civilization regarding truth from the divine, the realm of heaven, the realm of punishment, and the mathematics of morality. The Apocalypse of Peter functions in a manner similar to a system of courts belonging to the divine. Every transgression is met with its sentence calculated with precision. Every form of punishment corresponds to its offense with exactness that is mathematical. No amount in excess, no compassion, no option for making an appeal. Justice from the divine operates as bookkeeping regarding morality that is perfect. Those who spoke words of blasphemy remain suspended, held up by their tongues. The bodily organ they employed for speaking in opposition to God transforms into their anchor throughout eternity. Metal in a heated state moves underneath them, in sufficient proximity to sense the heat it produces, yet never in sufficient proximity to supply the release that destruction would bring. They dangle in expectation that is permanent, of a descent that never arrives. Women who enhance their appearance for the purpose of drawing into temptation. Men who were married to other women make the discovery that their hair has transformed into cord that cannot be broken. They remain suspended by these locks they cultivated with such care above chasms filled with flame. The self-admiration that motivated them to bring their appearance to a state of perfection now guarantees their suffering that is perfect. Physical attractiveness transforms into the tool of justice. Men possessing wealth, who turned away from giving charity to those living in poverty, discover themselves submerged in gold that has been melted, extending up to their necks. The riches they accumulated in hoards melt in the space around them, supplying neither relief nor ability to purchase. They lack the ability to make their escape from what they once chased after. Their riches transform into their source of agony. People who demanded interest on loans that was excessive make the discovery that their hands and feet extend in a manner that is unnatural, reaching in the direction of basins of pitch in a state of boiling. They extend their reach with desperation toward relief that stays forever past their ability to grasp. Their drive for accumulation generated separation from feeling compassion for other humans. At this point, separation establishes definition for their state throughout eternity. Those who committed murder encounter death in repeated fashion. They ascend structures that are tall, experience themselves being forced over the edges, go through every feeling that comes with fatal collision. Following that, they instantly undergo reformation to ascend once more. Every death delivers consciousness that is complete of the dying moments experienced by their victim. The capacity to feel what others felt makes its arrival too late to supply any relief. The exactness creates more astonishment than the brutality does. Justice from the divine functions with precision found in science. Every form of punishment creates reflection not merely of the wrongdoing, but of the specific way in which the wrongdoing was carried out. People who spoke lies hang suspended by their ears. People who delivered witness that was false hang suspended by their tongues. Parts of the body transform into tools for providing instruction. Young ones who experience death before arriving at awareness of morality engage in play within open fields, positioned beside streams that are crystalline. The sound of their joy supplies a contrasting element to the sounds of groaning coming from those who are damned. Purity is given shelter, while guilt is given education. The universe that is moral sustains equilibrium that is perfect. Celestial beings provide supervision for every punishment, with effectiveness that is bureaucratic. They take measurements of suffering in relation to wrongdoing, making adjustments to severity for the purpose of matching significance that is moral. Their expressions reveal no feeling, solely commitment to carrying out divine justice with accuracy. Compassion would bring compromise to the integrity of the system. The deceased who lived righteously make observations of these consequences without experiencing distress. Their purification encompasses reaction that is emotional and proper to justice from the divine. They develop comprehension that responsibility enhances rather than reduces love from the divine. They perceive magnificence within the balance that is terrible. However, certain offenses are met with consequences that go beyond what is easy to portray. People who brought corruption to young ones encounter torments that the text experiences difficulty attempting to express. The harm they caused was impossible to reverse. Their consequence must therefore exist beyond ability to comprehend. Certain wrongs create breakage in the mathematics of morality. Prophets who spoke falsely and directed those who believed down paths that were wrong go through torment that is psychological rather than physical in nature. They experience the state of hopelessness that their deceptions created, with that experience increased in proportion to all those they victimized. They bear the burden of every soul that was lost, every faith that sustained damage, every injury of a spiritual nature that their acts of deception brought into existence. Those who practiced religious deception discover their masks worn in public settings undergo permanent removal. They lack the ability to conceal themselves using pretense or standing in reputation. Their state of corruption from within transforms into something visible to all. They go through the experience of shame in the absence of any option for hiding or being saved. Reality transforms into their source of agony. The mathematics regarding morality extends past actions taken by individuals to the results they produced. A deception that is single in nature could bring destruction to a marriage. It could cause poverty for young ones and bring ruin to families that are multiple in number. Justice from the divine creates accounting for every effect that spreads outward. People who have sinned carry burden of responsibility not merely for the selections they made, but for all outcomes that those selections brought into being. Traders, motivated by greed, make the discovery that their devices for weighing and measuring that were false have transformed into the tools used for their torture. They must bear the weight of scales that are massive and never achieve balance, chasing after precision they never engaged in during their lifetime. The implements of their acts of deception transform into implements for their instruction. People who engaged in the practice of witchcraft or sought consultation with entities belonging to the spirit realm discover themselves in regions where acts of deception transform into something impossible. They pursued knowledge that was hidden by means that were forbidden. At this point, they hold possession of knowledge that is complete regarding their situation, yet possess no ability to bring change to it. Reality in the absence of hope transforms into their form of consequence. The layout of the realm of punishment creates reflection of classifications that are moral. Regions that are different provide housing for categories of people who sinned that are different. Channels of fire in a flowing state generate separations between classes of criminal behavior that are various. The landscape, in and of itself, conveys lessons regarding the manner in which evil undergoes organization and the exactness of response from the divine. And yet, the text maintains that this justice fulfills purposes that are educational. Every form of punishment conveys what the person who sinned experienced failure in learning throughout the period of life. Suffering transforms into material for education. Anguish undergoes transformation into comprehension, even though comprehension arrives too late to bring alteration to results. The deceased who lived righteously are given benefits that create mirrors of the selections they made while on earth. People who supplied nourishment to those experiencing hunger participate in feasting throughout eternity in the absence of excessive consumption. People who supplied garments to those lacking clothing wear articles made of illumination that never undergo fading. People who paid visits to those held in confinement move about in freedom that is perfect. Justice functions in both directions. Gardens experience blooming in locations where those who were faithful spend time walking in the company of patriarchs and prophets, flowing streams of water that gives life supply refreshment in the absence of causing drowning. Surfaces for dining display arrangements of nourishment that feeds in the absence of producing a state of being overly full. The realm of paradise functions according to principles that are different from earth, yet the reasoning that is moral and the same finds application. The Apocalypse of Peter brings forth presentation of a cosmos where every selection holds significance that is infinite. Not a single action undergoes disappearance in the absence of result. Not a single thought makes its escape from attention belonging to the divine. The mathematics regarding morality functions with precision that is perfect, generating accounting for every element that exists in the calculation of responsibility belonging to humanity. This bookkeeping regarding morality that is comprehensive generates both states of terror and states of comfort. It generates terror due to the fact that making an escape transforms into something impossible. It generates comfort due to the fact that wrongdoing is met with correction. The system delivers guarantees that good and evil are met with benefits that are proper to them. Justice that is perfect guarantees structure that is perfect. However, the text brings to the surface questions that create disturbance regarding the nature of the divine. Does justice that is perfect call for brutality that is perfect? Does instruction regarding morality provide justification for anguish that lasts throughout eternity? Do the forms of consequence correspond appropriately to the offenses? Or do they go beyond capacity belonging to humanity to carry out evil that is equivalent? These questions would in time make contribution to the exclusion of the text from Scripture that is canonical. Leaders within the Church experienced increasing discomfort with justice from the divine that appeared to go beyond mercy from the divine. They demonstrated preference for depictions of the nature of the divine that possessed greater balance and placed emphasis on willingness to forgive, positioned alongside responsibility. And yet, the Apocalypse of Peter keeps in preservation imagination regarding morality that texts deemed canonical take up with greater subtlety. It reveals to us Christians in the early period as they engaged in wrestling with questions that are fundamental regarding justice, responsibility, and governance from the divine. It makes visible their intense desire for knowledge with detail regarding reality that is moral and ultimate. The mathematics regarding morality that it brings forth in presentation could appear primitive to ways of thinking in modern times, yet it takes up concerns belonging to humanity that are permanent regarding justice and responsibility. It delivers promises that selections hold significance, that actions produce results, and that governance from the divine functions with precision that is perfect. Assurances of such nature generate appeal to understandings of morality that exist beyond boundaries belonging to culture. The emergence of writing that is apocalyptic. The world was approaching its conclusion. Footwear belonging to Roman soldiers moved in marching formation throughout the streets of Jerusalem. The temple underwent burning. Those who served as priests underwent scattering. The practice of making sacrifices came to a halt. Hope belonging to the Jewish people appeared to experience crushing underneath wheels belonging to the empire. Within such darkness, prophetic visions experienced flourishing. At times when powers belonging to the earth bring destruction to structure belonging to the divine, voices belonging to heaven deliver promises of bringing about restoration. Writing that is apocalyptic rises up from states of oppression in a manner similar to flowers that emerge from ground that has been scorched. Daniel, in the beginning, created the structure during the period of exile in Babylon. At the time when deities belonging to foreign lands held rule over territory that was holy, visions from the divine made visible truths that were hidden. Tours belonging to heaven revealed battles of cosmic nature between forces of good and forces of evil. Defeat, experienced on earth, underwent transformation into triumph belonging to the spirit. The book belonging to Enoch caused expansion of this tradition through portrayals, with elaboration of domains belonging to the celestial realm. Beings that were angels and had fallen brought corruption to bloodlines belonging to humanity. Creatures of giant size moved about across the earth. Judgment from the divine drew near with exactness that was mathematical. Bookkeeping regarding morality that was complex delivered promises of justice in the end. Every single detail belonging to the history of the cosmos fulfilled purposes belonging to the divine. Oppression belonging to Rome supplied soil that was fresh for imagination that was apocalyptic. Rebels belonging to the Jewish people engaged in battles that were impossible in opposition to force that was overwhelming. Religion belonging to tradition appeared to possess no power in opposition to machinery belonging to the empire. Writers focused on apocalyptic themes presented perspectives that were alternative on situations that appeared to possess no hope. These documents functioned as writing, focused on resistance presented in disguise as vision belonging to religion. They delivered promises that empires belonging to the earth fulfill plans belonging to the divine, despite what appearances suggest. They made visible weaknesses that were hidden within powers that appeared to possess no ability to be conquered. They provided encouragement for continuing to endure through providing description of triumph that is ultimate for people who are faithful. Christians in the early period received as inheritance this perspective of the world that was apocalyptic in the company of scriptures belonging to the Jewish people. Jesus in person spoke in manner that was apocalyptic regarding judgment that was coming and vindication from the divine. People who followed him held expectations of transformation that was imminent of conditions belonging to the earth. The kingdom belonging to heaven would bring replacement to all kingdoms belonging to the earth. However, the transformation that was expected underwent delay. Jesus underwent ascension in the absence of creating a kingdom that was visible. Disciples experienced death in the absence of being witness to return that had been promised. Power belonging to Rome experienced growth that made it stronger rather than weaker. Followers of Christ required explanations that were new for oppression that continued. Writing that was apocalyptic supplied those explanations. Documents such as the Apocalypse of Peter made visible the reasons why anguish continued and the time when it would reach its conclusion. They provided description of battles of cosmic nature that remained invisible to vision belonging to humans. They delivered promises that appeared to exist, fulfilled purposes belonging to the divine that were larger. The category of writing presented multiple benefits for communities belonging to Christianity that were under attack. It supplied explanation for anguish in the present as component of plan belonging to the divine. It supplied knowledge with detail regarding vindication in the future. It provided encouragement for continuing to endure by means of portrayals that were vivid of benefit in the end. It caused transformation of people who were victims into people who would be victors by means of vision that was prophetic. Authors focused on apocalyptic themes, put forward claims to authority by means of disclosure from the divine rather than education belonging to humans. They were given visions in a direct manner from sources belonging to heaven. They underwent tours of domains of cosmic nature under guidance belonging to angels. They became witness to gatherings belonging to the divine, engaged in planning of events belonging to the earth. Claims of such nature created bypass of structures belonging to religion that were traditional. This process of making democratic the disclosure from the divine generated appeal to communities existing at the margins. Those who believed and were ordinary could be given visions that were extraordinary. People cast out by society could transform into voices that were prophetic. Authority belonging to religion experienced flow from selection belonging to the divine rather than position belonging to institutions. Writing that was apocalyptic brought about leveling of structures related to power that were traditional. The documents also brought satisfaction to curiosity of the intellect regarding realities that were invisible. People desired knowledge with detail regarding domains belonging to heaven. They pursued information that was specific regarding justice from the divine. They possessed desire for explanations that were complete of purpose of cosmic nature. Writing that was apocalyptic supplied responses that were comprehensive of such nature. Influence belonging to philosophy from Greece gave shape to imagination belonging to Christianity that was apocalyptic. Concepts belonging to Plato regarding perfection that is invisible, positioned behind shadows that are visible, provided encouragement for maintaining belief in domains belonging to heaven, possessing greater reality than those belonging to the earth. Ideas belonging to the Stoics regarding governance from the divine supplied support for bookkeeping regarding morality that was detailed. Vocabulary belonging to philosophy brought enrichment to vision that was prophetic, yet writing that was apocalyptic sustained concerns that were distinctly belonging to Jewish and Christian people. It directed focus toward transformation of a historical nature rather than engagement in contemplation that was philosophical. It placed emphasis on taking action from the divine within matters belonging to humanity rather than engaging in speculation that was abstract. It delivered promises of justice for people experiencing oppression rather than wisdom for people belonging to the elite. The Apocalypse of Peter stands for the arrival at maturity of this tradition within circles belonging to Christianity. It generates combination of classifications regarding morality belonging to Jewish people with history regarding salvation belonging to Christian people. It employs ideas belonging to philosophy from Greece for the purpose of providing description of vision that is prophetic and Hebrew in nature. It takes up oppression belonging to Rome by means of disclosure from the divine. The consequences with detail belonging to the text create reflection of thinking related to legal matters that received influence from practice of law belonging to Rome. Every offense is met with consequence that is proportionate. Justice functions by means of putting into effect in a systematic manner of principles that are universal. Law belonging to the divine generates mirror of law belonging to the earth, while undergoing transcendence of the restrictions belonging to it. And yet, the apocalypse sustains criticism that is prophetic of systems belonging to justice on earth. It makes visible how standards belonging to the divine undergo exceeding of those belonging to humans. It delivers promises of responsibility that is perfect in locations where courts belonging to the earth experience failure. It gives assurance to those who read that offenses that are hidden are met with consequence that is public in locations of cosmic nature. Writing that was apocalyptic experienced flourishing throughout periods of disturbance belonging to culture at times when authorities belonging to tradition appeared to possess inadequacy. The category of writing supplied sources that were alternative of significance and hope. It made visible purposes belonging to the divine positioned behind disorder that appeared to exist. It delivered promises of vindication that is ultimate for continuing to endure with faithfulness. However, the same conditions that brought about generation of writing that was apocalyptic also brought about limitation of the appeal belonging to it. At times when pressure from outside underwent decrease, communities experienced lesser need for explanations of cosmic nature, of anguish belonging to the earth. At times when communities of believers obtained recognition from society, they demonstrated preference for theology that was less confrontational in nature. The emergence of writing that was apocalyptic creates reflection of requirement belonging to humanity for explanations regarding morality that are comprehensive. People desire to develop comprehension of the reasons why anguish possesses existence and the time when it will reach its conclusion. They pursue confidence that justice will, in the end, achieve triumph. They possess desire for knowledge with detail regarding governance from the divine. These requirements undergo transcendence of circumstances belonging to history that are particular. Every generation encounters situations that appear to undergo exceeding of ability belonging to humanity for arriving at resolution. Every period of time becomes witness to acts of wrongdoing that powers belonging to the earth lack ability or lack willingness to bring correction to. Every system belonging to culture brings forth production of visions of responsibility that is ultimate. The Apocalypse of Peter keeps in preservation one such vision, originating from the period when Christianity in its early form underwent formation. It reveals to us those who believed as they engaged in wrestling with questions that are fundamental regarding justice from the divine and responsibility belonging to humanity. It makes visible their state of confidence that structure of cosmic nature exists underneath disorder that appears to exist. However, it also supplies demonstration of the restrictions of methods that are purely descriptive in their approach to mystery belonging to the spirit. Certain realities push back against explanation with detail. Certain truths undergo transcendence of classifications belonging to humanity. Certain questions call for faith rather than possession of knowledge. The emergence of writing that was apocalyptic creates marking of both accomplishment and shortcoming of imagination belonging to religion. It experiences success in sustaining hope throughout circumstances that are desperate. It experiences failure at times when predictions with detail bring replacement to trust that is humble in wisdom belonging to the divine. The Apocalypse of Peter holds embodiment of both this achievement and this shortcoming. Peter, the person who is ordinary. Simon, given the name Peter, moves in stumbling fashion throughout the Gospels in a manner similar to a person engaged in learning how to move about upon the surface of water. He engages in speaking before engaging in thinking, takes action before developing comprehension, delivers promises exceeding what he possesses ability to carry through with. And yet, Jesus makes the selection of him as the stone used for foundation for the community of believers that is to arrive. It could be that wisdom belonging to the divine perceives capacity that vision belonging to humanity fails to notice. The fisherman, originating from Galilee, held possession of no training in theology, no standing related to rabbinical authority, no relationships to family connected to authority and religion. He carried out labor using his hands, engaged in speaking with manner of speech belonging to rural areas, bore upon him the odor of fish and water belonging to the lake, possessing commonality similar to bread eaten in the morning, possessing ordinariness similar to prayer offered in the evening. However, being ordinary rendered him extraordinary for purposes belonging to Christianity in its early form. Those who believed required a figure possessing apostolic standing, that they possessed ability to develop comprehension of, a person who engaged in struggling with states of doubt in a manner similar to themselves, a person who experienced failure in spectacular fashion and following that discovered willingness to forgive, a person whose states of weakness rendered grace from the divine something visible. The acts of denial carried out by Peter throughout the trial, experienced by Jesus, transformed in paradoxical manner into something that brought reassurance to followers of Christ at a later time. In the event that the apostle holding the position of chief possessed ability to experience failure so completely when placed under pressure, at that point, those who believed and were ordinary possessed no requirement to experience despair regarding their own experiences of failure. In the event that Peter possessed ability to undergo restoration to fellowship despite his act of betrayal, at that point being saved remained something possible for every person. The vision that underwent recording within the Apocalypse of Peter corresponds in perfect manner with this structure. Peter perceives justice from the divine with clarity that is startling, despite his shortcomings regarding morality. The very same person who engaged in denial of possessing knowledge of Jesus is given disclosure with detail regarding judgment of cosmic nature. Grace functions by means of vessels that possess flaws rather than those that are perfect. Communities belonging to Christianity in its early form discovered the humanity belonging to Peter, possessing greater capacity to provide encouragement than the brilliance belonging to Paul or the understandings that were mystical, belonging to John. Paul generated feelings of intimidation through his education and ability related to rhetoric. John moved with his sword past comprehension belonging to ordinary people. Peter sustained accessibility. The authority belonging to him that was spiritual arrived by means of weakness that was rendered strong rather than strength that underwent display. The apocalypse that receives attribution to Peter makes use of this accessibility for exploitation. The visions appear almost possessing excessive intensity for his nature that is simple. Disclosure from the divine brings about overwhelming of his ability belonging to humanity. He engages in struggling for the purpose of processing what enters his vision. This act of struggling renders the visions possessing greater believability rather than lesser. Those who read develop identification with the state of amazement experienced by Peter at justice from the divine. They hold in common with him his state of horror at the forms of consequence that undergo description. They develop comprehension of his difficulty, engaged in comprehending bookkeeping regarding morality that is so complete. The fisherman undergoes transformation into their guide throughout domains positioned past experience belonging to humanity. Questions belonging to Peter throughout the vision create reflection of concerns belonging to humans that are ordinary. He desires to develop knowledge of the reasons why certain forms of consequence appear to possess such severity. He engages in struggling for the purpose of bringing about reconciliation of mercy from the divine with justice from the divine. He pursues explanation for anguish that undergoes exceeding of causes that are apparent. His state of confusion generates mirror of confusion belonging to those who read. The document brings forth presentation of Peter as a person bearing witness who possesses reluctance rather than a prophet possessing eagerness. He is given disclosure that he failed to pursue regarding realities he would demonstrate preference for staying away from. This state of reluctance adds quality of being authentic to the testimony belonging to him. Prophets possessing eagerness could engage in exaggeration for the purpose of creating effect. People bearing witness who possess reluctance appear to possess greater trustworthiness. The manner in which Peter undergoes characterization also fulfills purposes that are pedagogical. Questions belonging to him generate opportunities for explanations with detail. The confusion belonging to him calls for instruction that is careful. Reactions belonging to him that are emotional create models of reactions that are appropriate to disclosure from the divine. The document conveys instruction by means of the process of learning belonging to him. However, the Apocalypse also brings about transformation of Peter in manners that depictions from the Gospel at an earlier time fail to put forward as suggestion. The fisherman possessing impulses undergoes transformation into a person making observations of justice from the divine who possesses patience. The person who severed the ear belonging to a soldier during the defense of Jesus in a physical manner observes consequences that last throughout eternity in the absence of making protest. The apostle who engaged in weeping in a bitter manner regarding his acts of denial reveals no feeling at anguish of cosmic nature. This act of transformation creates reflection of comprehension, belonging to Christianity in its early form of maturation, belonging to the Spirit. Appearances following resurrection brought about change in the disciples in a fundamental manner. They were given ability that was new for disclosure from the divine. Their restrictions belonging to humanity underwent transformation into pathways for wisdom, belonging to heaven, rather than barriers to comprehension, belonging to the Spirit. The evolution of Peter from a person engaged in denial into a person who sees visions presented hope in an offered manner to those who believed and were struggling. In the event that grace from the divine possessed ability to bring about transformation of failure that was so complete into authority belonging to apostles, at that point, not a single person sustained position past being saved. The most profound sinner has the potential to transform into the most exceptional saint when divine power intervenes. The apocalyptic text leverages Peter's well-known reputation for being emotionally intense and volatile. His fervent, passionate character made him a believable witness when it came to emotionally charged subject matter. Someone with a more reserved, controlled disposition might relay descriptions of terrible punishments in a detached, clinical manner. Peter's fierce intensity persuades readers that these visions genuinely shook him to his core. However, the text demands that Peter keep his composure intact during his entire cosmic journey. He poses questions, but he never challenges the righteousness of divine judgment. He demonstrates wonder and astonishment, but he never raises objections to the punishments being administered. His human qualities remain secondary to his role as a prophet. This careful equilibrium between relatability and spiritual authority positioned Peter as the perfect conduit for apocalyptic writings. Believers found it easy to connect with his human frailties and struggles, while simultaneously accepting the divine revelations he delivered. They placed their trust in his account precisely because they could recognize his human limitations. The very weaknesses he possessed served to validate his strengths. Peter's involvement in the apocalyptic vision also granted legitimacy to its theological assertions. The endorsement from the foremost apostle carried a significance that anonymous visions simply could not replicate. Church congregations, already acquainted with Peter through his appearances in gospel narratives, would readily embrace revelations attributed to his name. The text positions Peter as a connecting point between the earthly domain and the celestial sphere. His human essence allows him to communicate effectively with everyday believers. His apostolic credentials validate the divine revelations being transmitted. He converts cosmic realities into language that ordinary people can grasp and comprehend. However, Peter's everyman characteristics create friction with the apocalypse's complex moral classifications. The humble fisherman abruptly exhibits intricate understanding of divine justice principles. His verbal repertoire expands to include theological terminology that seems to surpass his apparent level of formal education. This friction mirrors wider challenges present in apocalyptic writings. How can human writers communicate divine revelations without overstepping the boundaries of their natural capabilities? How do they preserve their credibility while recounting experiences that seem impossible? The Peter character represents an attempt to bridge these contradictions. The Apocalypse frames Peter's visions as a gift bestowed upon him, not something he earned through personal merit. He obtains revelation through divine grace, instead of through human striving or accomplishment. This focus maintains his modest standing while accounting for his remarkable knowledge and insight. Divine initiative serves as the bridge, spanning the chasm between human constraints and cosmic understanding. Peter's emotional reactions during the vision also demonstrate proper Christian responses to divine justice. He displays fitting reverence when encountering heavenly domains. He exhibits suitable concern regarding human anguish and suffering. He shows correct deference to divine authority in all matters. These modeled reactions instruct readers on how they themselves ought to respond to the Apocalypse's revelations. Peter's emotional transformation becomes something of an instruction guide for appropriate spiritual responses. His progression from bewilderment to acceptance maps out the journey that believers ought to undertake. The text employs Peter's presence to preemptively address objections that future readers might potentially voice. If the punishments appear disproportionately severe, Peter's acceptance serves to validate their suitability. If divine justice seems devoid of mercy, Peter's compliance confirms its absolute necessity. The apostle's endorsement cuts off criticism before it can gain traction. Yet Peter's humanity simultaneously restricts the Apocalypse's level of theological complexity. Intricate philosophical reasoning would exceed what seems plausible for his apparent intellectual capacity. Nuanced theological distinctions might overwhelm his straightforward nature and simple background. The text must remain consistent with his established character, while simultaneously conveying divine revelation. This constraint influences the Apocalypse's direct, literal methodology regarding divine justice. Peter receives visions. He possesses the capacity to comprehend, and descriptions he has the ability to relay to others. The elaborate allegory characteristic of canonical revelation would surpass his abilities to interpret and understand. Uncomplicated moral categories align well with his direct, no-nonsense disposition. Peter's everyman attributes rendered the Apocalypse of Peter readily accessible to common Christian believers throughout various communities. They recognized themselves in his confusion and uncertainty, in his probing questions, in his gradual progression toward understanding. They placed confidence in testimony coming from someone who experienced the same struggles with faith and doubt that they themselves faced. But this very same accessibility ultimately played a role in the text's removal from canonical scripture. As Christianity cultivated increasingly sophisticated theological frameworks, Peter's straightforward moral classifications appeared insufficient and inadequate. Church authorities came to prefer approaches to divine justice that offered greater nuance and depth. The fisherman hailing from Galilee fulfilled early Christianity's requirement for accessible apostolic validation and authority. He served as a bridge, connecting divine revelation with human comprehension and understanding. He rendered cosmic truths understandable to minds of ordinary capacity. His involvement validated claims that would otherwise seem too extraordinary to believe. Yet Peter's inherent limitations simultaneously placed constraints on the Apocalypse's theological evolution and development. His character could not develop beyond certain parameters without sacrificing credibility and believability. The text remained confined within boundaries established by the portrayals found in gospel accounts. The Apocalypse of Peter maintains Peter's everyman accessibility while attempting to extend it toward prophetic authority and stature. The outcome exposes both the advantages and the disadvantages of employing familiar figures to legitimize new revelations and teachings. Accessibility and authority occasionally come into conflict in manners that end up compromising both qualities. Competing visions of the end times. The early Christian world hummed and vibrated with competing apocalyptic texts and visions. Every text made assertions of divine authority and origin. Every vision offered unique perspectives into humanity's ultimate fate and destiny. Every apocalypse drew devoted adherents who maintained that their preferred revelation held the complete and total truth. The intellectual marketplace functioned without any centralized regulatory authority or oversight. The Apocalypse of Paul surfaced from Egyptian monastic communities, claiming to disclose the apostles' expedition through celestial realms and domains. Paul obtains a guided expedition through paradise and regions of punishment alike. Angelic beings explain the workings of divine justice with measured, patient thoroughness. The vision places greater emphasis on mercy over judgment, on forgiveness over condemnation and punishment. Where Peter's apocalypse concentrates on punishment corresponding to crime, Paul's emphasizes divine compassion toward human frailty and weakness. Those who have sinned receive correction intended for rehabilitation and restoration instead of simple retribution. Even the condemned souls benefit from Sunday respites during which torments temporarily halt and cease. Divine love functions in tandem with divine justice, operating side by side. The Shepherd of Hermas presents yet another distinct viewpoint on divine judgment and accountability. Hermas obtains visions transmitted through an angelic intermediary who manifests in the form of a shepherd. The revelations place emphasis on repentance and moral transformation instead of cosmic punishment and retribution. Personal, individual transformation carries more weight than cosmic transformation on a universal scale. Hermas observes the church represented as a tower currently under construction. Certain stones integrate seamlessly into the divine architectural design. Other stones require reshaping and refinement before they can become useful for the structure. A small number must be entirely rejected and discarded. But the construction project continues forward with patience, care, and skill. Divine grace offers multiple chances for spiritual reconstruction and renewal. This vision resonated with communities grappling with difficult questions about membership and belonging. What becomes of Christians who commit sins following their baptism? Can they obtain forgiveness once again? How many opportunities does divine mercy actually provide to fallen believers? The shepherd responds with hope and encouragement instead of terror and dread. The canonical revelation of John functions on an entirely different magnitude and scale. John witnesses cosmic warfare between forces of good and evil locked in battle. Dragons and beasts symbolize earthly powers that stand in opposition to divine authority and sovereignty. Symbolic numbers contain concealed meanings pertaining to historical occurrences and future transformations yet to come. John's visions demand interpretation and careful analysis. The imagery functions on multiple simultaneous levels at once. Earthly happenings reflect heavenly realities taking place in celestial realms. Political developments fulfill prophetic patterns laid out in advance. History progresses toward a predetermined conclusion, despite surface appearances of chaos and disorder. Divine sovereignty encompasses all earthly contingencies and possibilities. These divergent approaches reflected different community requirements and theological inclinations and preferences. Urban congregations with educated memberships gravitated toward symbolic complexity and layered meanings. Rural communities found value in straightforward, literal descriptions they could readily grasp. Persecuted believers sought cosmic vindication for their suffering and sacrifice. Well-established churches placed emphasis on moral guidance and instruction for daily living. The Apocalypse of Peter carved out a distinctive niche within this competitive landscape and environment. Its elaborate punishments satisfied curiosity regarding the mechanics of divine justice. Its moral classifications offered unambiguous behavioral guidance and direction. Its teaching-oriented approach fulfilled instructional objectives and purposes. Its vivid, graphic content generated impressions that lingered in memory. But comparison with alternative texts exposed the work's inherent limitations and shortcomings. Paul's Apocalypse delivered theology of greater sophistication and depth. Hermas offered more pastoral care and sensitivity toward human weakness. John provided superior literary craftsmanship and artistry. Peter's vision appeared crude and unsophisticated when set against these alternatives. The competitive climate also stimulated textual evolution and development. Scribes expanded well-received apocalypses by incorporating additional visions and clarifications. Communities inserted local concerns into universal revelations of broader scope. Translations modified content to suit different cultural environments and contexts. Texts underwent evolution through practical use instead of remaining fixed and static. This fluid state makes establishing original forms of early Christian apocalypses genuinely difficult. Multiple versions enjoyed simultaneous circulation across different regions. Different communities maintained and preserved different textual traditions. Scholars must piece together developmental patterns from incomplete, fragmentary evidence that survives. The Apocalypse of Peter endured in multiple forms that reflect this evolutionary process. Ethiopic versions preserve material nowhere to be found in Greek fragments that survive. Latin translations incorporate passages entirely absent from Coptic texts. Each tradition retained certain elements while allowing others to disappear. But specific features set Peter's Apocalypse apart from its competitors throughout this entire development. The precise correspondence between transgression and punishment remained a constant feature. The literal, straightforward approach to divine justice persisted across versions. The pedagogical emphasis carried through in different textual traditions. These characteristic features appealed to particular audiences while simultaneously alienating other groups. Communities that placed high value on moral instruction found the clear behavioral guidance appealing. Churches that emphasized theological sophistication viewed the literal approach as problematic and limiting. The competitive environment gradually showed preference for texts that successfully balanced multiple concerns simultaneously. John's revelation merged symbolic depth with pastoral relevance and application. It addressed the reality of persecution while preserving hope for the future. It supplied sufficient specific detail to appear authentic while maintaining enough generality to apply across varying circumstances and situations. The Shepherd of Hermas achieved success by concentrating on practical questions surrounding Christian living and conduct. It tackled real problems that communities encountered on a daily basis. Its visions addressed immediate requirements rather than satisfying abstract curiosity about distant matters. Its authority stemmed from practical usefulness instead of claims regarding apostolic authorship and origin. Paul's Apocalypse attracted followers through its strong emphasis on divine mercy and ultimate restoration. It held out the promise of eventual restoration for all of creation. It achieved balance between justice and forgiveness in ways that brought comfort to troubled consciences, burdened by guilt. Its theology progressed beyond primitive moral accounting and simple scorekeeping. These successful texts possess certain shared qualities that Peter's Apocalypse happened to lack. They presented hope in addition to judgment and condemnation. They supplied theological sophistication in addition to moral instruction and guidance. They balanced divine transcendence with divine accessibility and approachability. They fulfilled multiple community functions instead of serving single narrow purposes. The apocalypse of Peter's gradual marginalization resulted in part from its failure to compete effectively within this diverse marketplace of ideas. Its strengths held appeal for specific audiences, yet its limitations created distance with broader constituencies and groups. Its graphic content simultaneously attracted certain readers while repelling potential others. Yet the competitive environment also extended the text's survival beyond what might otherwise have occurred. Different communities maintained different preferences regarding what should be considered canonical. Texts facing rejection in one geographical region discovered acceptance in another location. The Apocalypse of Peter continued to circulate even following the loss of official recognition and status. The competing visions illuminate how early Christianity wrestled with understanding divine justice and human destiny and fate. Different communities arrived at different conclusions regarding divine nature and human responsibility before God. Various apocalypses gave expression to these diverse theological preferences and emphases. Modern readers gain benefit from this diversity by observing the range of available options that early believers could choose among. The canonical process selected certain visions for preservation while setting aside others for rejection. But the rejected alternatives reveal to us what possibilities existed but were not chosen. They expose paths that early Christianity elected not to pursue or follow. The Apocalypse of Peter represents one such alternative pathway and trajectory. A Christianity oriented primarily around moral accounting instead of theological sophistication and complexity. A faith that assigned higher value to detailed knowledge of divine justice over humble acceptance of divine mystery. A religious expression that preferred fear over comfort as the primary motivation for righteous behavior and conduct. Its competition with alternative visions assists in explaining both its temporary success and its ultimate failure. The text fulfilled important functions for early Christian communities during a specific period, but it could not adapt effectively to evolving theological preferences and shifting pastoral requirements. Its inflexibility transformed from strength into liability over time. The Torments, a guided tour. The journey commences at the boundary of an immense chasm stretching into distance. Peter stands alongside Jesus on terrain that feels firm and solid under his feet, yet somehow occupies space between earthly and heavenly realms. Spread before them lies a landscape organized by absolute moral geography. Light and shadow designate eternal boundaries that no soul possesses the ability to traverse or cross. To the right side, gardens flourish in endless springtime beauty. Transparent streams meander between trees heavy with blossoms and flowers. The righteous deceased walk, clothed in garments of pure, radiant light. Their faces emit perfect peace and tranquility. They proceed with clear purpose, yet without any sense of urgency or haste. They engage in discussions that extend across centuries without ever running dry of subjects to explore. But Peter's focus pulls leftward toward territories where divine justice functions with surgical exactness and precision. The atmosphere ripples with heat, radiating from fires that burn without ever consuming what they touch. Voices ascend in coordinated harmonies of agony that never reach resolution or conclusion. This represents the place where those who sinned discover what they failed to grasp during their earthly lives. The initial region contains those who uttered falsehoods against their fellow human beings. They hang in suspension by their tongues, positioned over pools filled with molten metal. The very organ they employed to demolish reputations transforms into their eternal anchor point. They possess no ability to speak, no capacity to cry out for help, no means to explain themselves or offer excuses. Truth manifests itself visibly through their ongoing suffering. Their tongues extend to unnatural lengths, supporting the complete weight of their physical bodies. The tissue never ruptures, despite the seemingly impossible strain being applied. Divine justice guarantees that punishment aligns with crime in precise measure. Those who spread lies through whispers hang positioned lower than those who broadcast them with bold proclamation. Each specific position reflects the particular damage their spoken words generated and created. Proceeding deeper into this moral terrain, Peter comes upon women who decorated and adorned themselves to attract and seduce the husbands of other women. They hang, suspended by their carefully groomed and cultivated hair, positioned over chasms filled with flame. The beauty they refined and perfected for purposes of corruption now guarantees their perfect correction and instruction. Vanity transforms into the very instrument of their teaching and discipline. Their hair never catches fire despite its close proximity to the flames positioned below. Every individual strand maintains strength comparable to iron, while retaining sensitivity to every possible sensation. They experience the intense heat, but possess no means of escape from it. Cannot sever their locks or ascend upward to safety. The very femininity they turned into a weapon now holds them imprisoned completely and totally. In neighboring territories, those who imposed excessive interest rates endure punishments that mirror and reflect their greed and avarice. They stand submerged up to their necks in rivers composed of molten gold flowing around them. The wealth they pursued with such determination now encircles them on all sides. They cannot break free from what they formerly desired above all else, cannot purchase any relief using the treasure that actively destroys them. Their hands stretch continuously toward the surface above, yet cannot penetrate through to freedom. The gold maintains flawless fluidity that provides no grip or purchase for climbing. They sink incrementally with each frantic attempt to rise upward toward escape. Their treasure becomes simultaneously their tomb, beautiful and terrible at the same time. Peter observes merchants who employed dishonest weights and deceptive measures in their business dealings. They carry enormous scales that never manage to achieve balance or equilibrium. The tools of their deception transform into implements of their eternal education and instruction. They must now pursue the accuracy they never bothered to practice during their earthly lives. Perfect weights remain perpetually beyond their ability to manipulate or achieve. Each scale increases in weight with continued use instead of becoming lighter or easier to manage. The merchants stumble forward under mounting burdens that reflect the accumulated damage their dishonesty generated over time. They possess no ability to rest, no option to delegate responsibility, no permission to abandon their impossible assigned task. Divine justice demands personal accountability from each individual. Those who engaged in witchcraft or sought consultation with forbidden spirits discover themselves in territories where deception becomes utterly impossible to maintain. They sought access to hidden knowledge through means that were illegitimate and forbidden. Now they possess comprehensive knowledge of their situation combined with zero power to alter or change it. Truth, stripped of hope, transforms into their punishment and torment. Demons they previously summoned now function as their prison guards and jailers. The spirits ridicule and mock their former allies with flawless, perfect cruelty. The magical powers they actively pursued during life now operate against them with impeccable efficiency and effectiveness. Their occult knowledge reveals only the absolute completeness of their condemnation and doom. Peter bears witness to punishments designed for sins committed against children that exceed his capacity to describe with complete accuracy. The text itself appears to struggle, conveying torments capable of matching crimes so profoundly destructive in nature. Certain corruptions shatter moral mathematics entirely and completely. Divine justice transcends human capacity to fully comprehend or adequately explain. The geography itself imparts lessons regarding the organizational structure of evil and wickedness. Rivers, composed of fire, create separations between different categories of those who sinned. Each stream burns at temperatures specifically calibrated for particular crimes and transgressions. Those who brought harm to children suffer within the most intense flames. Those whose offense merely involved gossip endure cooler forms of correction. Angels move between different regions with bureaucratic efficiency and precision. They measure suffering against sin committed, making adjustments to intensity to preserve perfect proportions and balance. Their faces display no emotion whatsoever, only unwavering dedication to accurate implementation of divine justice. Introducing mercy would undermine the system's integrity and proper functioning. But the tour simultaneously reveals unexpected mercy operating within the framework of perfect justice. Children who perished before attaining moral awareness play freely in meadows situated beside crystal-clear streams. Their laughter serves as counterpoint to the suffering of adults in other regions. Innocence receives protection and shelter, while guilt receives education through punishment. The righteous deceased observe these ongoing punishments without experiencing any distress or emotional turmoil. Their sanctification encompasses proper emotional response to witnessing divine justice in operation. They comprehend that accountability strengthens rather than weakens divine love. They perceive beauty within the terrible symmetry that maintains cosmic order and balance. Peter's guide provides explanation that each punishment fulfills educational purposes and objectives. Pain transforms into curriculum specifically designed to teach what sinners never managed to learn during their time alive. Suffering converts into understanding and comprehension, though understanding arrives too late to modify consequences already set. Divine teaching methodology operates with infinite patience that never exhausts itself. The most intricate and elaborate punishments await religious hypocrites and teachers of falsehood. They undergo psychological torments that surpass physical ones in severity and impact. They experience the despair their lives generated and produced, multiplied across every victim their actions touched. They bear responsibility for each and every soul damaged by the deception they created and spread. Their public masks remain permanently stripped away and removed. They possess no ability to conceal themselves behind reputation or false pretense. Their internal corruption becomes visible and apparent to all observers. They experience shame devoid of any possibility for concealment or redemption and restoration. Truth itself becomes their most unbearable form of torment and anguish. Certain regions hold sinners whose crimes possess such subtlety that earthly legal systems could not properly address them. Those who destroyed marriages through spreading gossip and rumors, those who corrupted children through setting bad examples for them to follow, those who led others into error through spiritual negligence and carelessness. Divine justice maintains accounting for every consequence flowing from every choice ever made. The comprehensive tour overwhelms Peter's human capacity for comprehension and processing. He struggles to fully process the complete scope of divine moral accounting and record-keeping. Every action monitored and recorded. Every thought evaluated and assessed, every consequence traced back to its original source. The universe functions as a vast courtroom where absolutely nothing manages to escape judgment and evaluation. As the vision draws toward its conclusion, Peter grasps that he has witnessed not arbitrary cruelty, but educational consequence delivered with purpose. Divine justice operates as a perfect teaching system, specifically designed to ensure that truth becomes completely inescapable. The punishments correspond not merely to the crimes themselves, but to the specific blindness that enabled and permitted them. The tour leaves Peter permanently transformed and altered. He has observed the complete moral architecture undergirding the universe. He comprehends that every choice carries infinite significance and weight. He knows that divine justice operates with mathematical precision that accounts for every variable factor in human responsibility and accountability. This knowledge becomes simultaneously burden and blessing, carrying both weights. Burden, because the accounting system terrifies and disturbs. Blessing, because justice provides guarantee that evil will receive what it deserves. The vision supplies both warning and comfort, depending entirely on the moral condition of whoever receives it. What the early church feared, Early Christian communities existed with death as their most intimate and constant neighbor. Plagues swept through urban centers without advance warning or notice. Childbirth routinely claimed the lives of mothers, bringing new life. Violence erupted over disagreements regarding religious matters and beliefs. Roman governing authorities possessed power to order executions based on imperial whim alone. Life terminated suddenly, frequently with brutality, always with absolute finality. This intimate proximity to mortality intensified spiritual anxieties that comfortable modern believers seldom, if ever, experienced directly. Death might arrive before the process of repentance could reach completion. Divine judgment might descend before moral reformation could be fully achieved. Eternity might commence while spiritual accounts remained unbalanced and unsettled. The Apocalypse of Peter addresses these anxieties directly with surgical precision and accuracy. Every fear obtains detailed treatment and examination. Every source of worry discovers specific address and response. The text functions like a diagnostic manual, cataloging spiritual terror, identifying symptoms while prescribing remedies through graphic deterrence and warning. Christians harbored fears that their secret sins remained successfully hidden from human authority, yet remained completely visible to divine surveillance and oversight. The Apocalypse validates their worst suspicions and concerns. Divine justice operates with total, complete knowledge of every action taken, every thought entertained, every hidden motivation harbored. Nothing whatsoever escapes cosmic accounting and record-keeping. Private sins obtain public punishment within Peter's vision and revelation. Adulterers who successfully concealed their crimes from their spouses discover their corruption displayed and exposed before all creation. Thieves who carefully covered their tracks find their greed laid bare eternally for all to see. Secrecy offers no protection whatsoever from ultimate revelation and exposure. But the text discloses that early Christians feared certain specific sins more intensely than others. Sexual corruption occupies the top position on every punishment catalogue and list. Those who violated marriage bonds, seduced virgins, or participated in forbidden relationships encounter elaborate, detailed torments. Sexual purity represented an obsession for early Christian communities throughout the ancient world. This obsession reflected cultural context and environment more than universal moral principles applicable across all times. Roman society functioned with sexual freedoms that scandalized both Jewish and Christian sensibilities and values. Temple prostitution normalized behaviors that monotheistic faiths regarded as abominable and detestable. Sexual restraint transformed into a marker of distinct religious identity and commitment. Women who beautified themselves to attract inappropriate male attention receive particular condemnation within the Apocalypse's framework. Their hair transforms into rope, binding them. Their cosmetics convert into fire, burning them. Their jewelry becomes chains, restraining them. The text exposes deep anxiety regarding female sexuality and its perceived power to corrupt male virtue and righteousness. Early Christian communities struggled intensely with questions surrounding female participation in religious life and leadership. Could women legitimately teach others? Could they speak during public assemblies? Could they exercise authority over male believers? The Apocalypse of Peter suggests that female beauty itself constitutes spiritual danger, demanding divine correction and restraint. Economic anxieties also saturate and permeate the text's catalogue of punishments. Merchants who deceived and cheated customers encounter eternal consequences for their actions. Those who imposed excessive interest rates suffer immersion in molten gold. Wealthy people who deliberately ignored poor neighbors endure carefully calibrated torments designed specifically for them. Wealth itself falls under suspicion and becomes potentially dangerous. These concerns reflected economic realities faced by early Christian communities on the ground. Most believers belonged to artisan and merchant classes that operated on extremely narrow profit margins. Economic survival demanded careful attention to principles of fair dealing and honest business. Religious communities depended entirely on voluntary contributions that wealth inequality could potentially undermine and destroy. But the apocalypse simultaneously reveals fears surrounding religious authority and maintaining orthodox belief. False teachers encounter punishments that exceed those administered to ordinary sinners by significant margin. They undergo psychological torments that multiply the suffering of all their victims combined. Their responsibility extends well beyond personal sin to encompass communal damage they inflicted. Early Christianity operated without centralized authority capable of establishing clear doctrinal boundaries and definitions. Multiple teachers competed simultaneously for influence over believers. Various interpretations of Christian truth circulated at the same time across different regions. Communities worried intensely about following deceptive leaders who might jeopardize their eternal destinies and salvation. The text addresses parental anxieties regarding child rearing within morally dangerous environments and cultural contexts. Those who corrupted children through bad example or active intentional harm faced torments that surpass adequate description. Parents required assurance that divine justice would protect innocence even when human legal systems failed completely. Children represented simultaneously both hope and vulnerability for early Christian communities throughout the empire. They carried faith forward into future generations yet to come, but they required protection from corrupting influences all around them. The apocalypse delivers promise that those who damage young souls will face consequences matching the gravity of their crimes. Religious hypocrisy generated particularly intense anxiety because it combines both spiritual and social dangers simultaneously. Hypocrites corrupted religious community from within while maintaining public respect and admiration from without. They inflicted damage on faith from inside positions of trust while appearing exemplary to external observers. Their deception threatened both individual and communal salvation at once. The Apocalypse of Peter exposes religious masks through divine vision, functioning like an X-ray, revealing hidden truth. Hypocrites cannot maintain their pretense under perfect, penetrating scrutiny. Their internal corruption becomes visible and apparent to all observers without exception. They undergo shame devoid of any possibility for concealment or redemption. Truth becomes their most unbearable torment imaginable. Early Christians also feared that divine justice might experience such prolonged delay that evil would appear to triumph permanently without correction. The Apocalypse addresses this particular concern by supplying detailed accounts of punishment that will eventually arrive. Justice operates with perfect accuracy despite appearances of delay and postponement. But the text unveils deeper fears regarding the very nature of divinity itself. Does perfect justice necessarily require perfect cruelty in its administration? Does moral instruction justify eternal suffering without possibility of relief? Does divine love operate in tandem with divine wrath, or does one quality exclude the other entirely? The Apocalypse supplies answers that theologians in later generations would discover deeply troubling and problematic. The graphic punishments suggest that early Christians imagined divine justice in thoroughly legal terms and categories. Crime must be followed inevitably by proportionate punishment. Moral accounting must achieve perfect balance. Divine governance must operate according to principles that human minds can understand, approve, and accept. This legalistic approach to divine justice both comforted and terrified early believers simultaneously. It brought comfort because it guaranteed that evil would receive proper correction and judgment. It generated terror because it promised that personal failures would likewise receive perfect punishment, matching their severity. Divine justice operated without showing favoritism or extending mercy beyond strict requirements. Women faced particular anxieties within early Christian communities because they possessed fewer legal protections and economic options than men. The Apocalypse addresses their concerns by demonstrating that divine justice protects the vulnerable while punishing those who exploit weakness and disadvantage. Yet the text simultaneously reveals cultural anxieties regarding female nature that modern readers discover disturbing and offensive. Women appear primarily either as sources of temptation or as victims of male corruption and abuse. Their spiritual capacity seems confined to roles that support rather than lead religious communities forward. Early Christians harbored fears that their religious conversion might fail to protect them from divine judgment if their moral transformation remained incomplete and insufficient. The Apocalypse suggests that divine justice evaluates actual behavior and conduct rather than mere religious profession and claims. Conversion supplies opportunity rather than providing automatic guarantee of favorable judgment. This concern reflects the practical difficulties of achieving moral reformation within corrupt environments and social contexts. How could believers successfully avoid contamination while remaining engaged with unconverted neighbors and associates? How could they maintain spiritual purity while simultaneously meeting economic necessities for survival? The Apocalypse provides motivation through detailed consequences painted in vivid, memorable imagery. The fears systematically catalogued in the Apocalypse of Peter illuminate early Christianity's struggle to maintain moral standards while engaging corrupt society surrounding them. Believers required clear boundaries, distinguishing acceptable from forbidden behavior and conduct. They demanded detailed knowledge regarding divine expectations and consequences for failure. But these same fears simultaneously shaped Christian theology in ways that subsequent generations would discover problematic and limiting. The emphasis placed on punishment rather than restoration and healing. The focus directed toward individual accountability rather than communal transformation and renewal. The preference shown for fear rather than love as primary spiritual motivation and driving force. Understanding precisely what early Christians feared assists in explaining both the Apocalypse of Peter's initial popularity and its eventual rejection from canonical status. The text addressed genuine anxieties that canonical books handled with greater subtlety and nuance. It supplied detailed answers that sophisticated theology would ultimately consider inappropriate and inadequate. Alexandria, the battleground of belief. The ancient city of Alexandria extended along Egypt's Mediterranean coastline like a precious jewel capturing and reflecting sunlight. Ships arriving from across the known world filled its harbor to capacity. Their holds carried heavy loads of both goods and ideas from distant lands. Merchants engaged in haggling using a dozen different languages, while scholars conducted debates in courtyards, offering shade and privacy. This was no ordinary commercial port city. Alexandria had transformed into the pulsing heart of early Christian intellectual thought and development. The great library stood as living testament to humanity's insatiable hunger for knowledge and wisdom. Scrolls occupied countless shelves stretching in every direction. Each one represented a doorway leading to either wisdom or heresy, depending entirely on who controlled access. Christian scribes labored alongside pagan philosophers, Jewish rabbis, and enigmatic followers of distant, foreign gods. Their reed pens scratched steadily across papyrus surfaces, copying texts destined to shape human souls for centuries ahead. In the cramped streets extending beyond the library's walls, theological battles raged with surprising intensity and heat. Groups of believers assembled in private homes and working shops. Each group claimed to possess the authentic, true gospel message. Some aligned themselves with the teachings of Arius, who maintained that Christ occupied a lesser position than the Father. Others embraced Gnostic mysteries, actively seeking secret knowledge deliberately hidden from common folk. Still, others clung firmly to what they called orthodox faith, though that particular term carried different meanings for different people and groups. The Apocalypse of Peter discovered fertile ground within this chaotic environment of competing truth claims. Wealthy merchants provided funding for scribes to produce copies of the text. They sensed its potential power to guide moral behavior within their trading establishments. Ascetic monks transported handwritten versions into the desert wilderness. They employed Peter's visions to fuel and intensify their own spiritual discipline and practices. Teachers in the catechetical school incorporated passages into their lesson plans. They watched as students' eyes widened in response to descriptions of divine justice being administered. Alexandria's thriving papyrus trade rendered copying texts remarkably simple and efficient. Local workshops possessed capacity to generate dozens of copies within mere weeks. New ideas spread faster here than anywhere else throughout the empire. The Apocalypse of Peter rode these powerful currents of information flow. It multiplied across the city's Christian communities like seeds scattered on fertile wind-finding purchase. Theological debates in Alexandria frequently turned intensely personal and hostile. Bishops leveled accusations of false doctrine against rivals, while crowds gathered to witness public arguments regarding scripture interpretation. The Apocalypse of Peter became ammunition deployed in these ongoing conflicts. Some leaders offered praise for its moral clarity and apostolic authority. Others raised questions regarding its harsh imagery and uncertain origins and authorship. In the city's Jewish quarter, rabbis monitored Christian developments with keen, careful interest. Many recognized familiar elements from their own apocalyptic traditions within Peter's visions and revelations. The descriptions of punishment echoed themes drawn from the Book of Enoch and other texts their ancestors had treasured and preserved. This familiarity generated sympathy toward Christian claims among some Jews. Others perceived dangerous distortions of sacred truth requiring opposition. Women fulfilled crucial roles within Alexandria's Christian networks and communities, though history has frequently forgotten or overlooked their contributions. Wealthy widows supplied funding for copying projects and hosted house churches where new texts received public reading. Female teachers shared Peter's visions with younger believers under their care. They emphasized the text's warnings regarding moral purity and divine judgment awaiting the unrighteous. The Apocalypse of Peter flourished in Alexandria because the city itself embodied the spirit of spiritual seeking and inquiry. People journeyed there hungry for answers to life's most profound and difficult questions. They wanted to know what awaited beyond death's threshold. They sought understanding of how to live righteously. They desired knowledge of what God expected from faithful believers. Peter's detailed visions provided concrete answers to fears that remained otherwise abstract and undefined. Alexandria's Christian communities cultivated their own distinct interpretations of the text and its meanings. Some emphasized its warnings regarding wealth and greed. These interpretations appealed to working people struggling under the weight of Roman taxation. Others concentrated on punishments designed for false teaching. They wielded Peter's authority to attack theological opponents and rivals. The text functioned as a mirror, reflecting each group's specific anxieties and cherished hopes. The city's intellectual atmosphere simultaneously bred criticism, directed at the Apocalypse of Peter. Sophisticated theologians raised questions regarding its crude imagery and overly simplistic moral framework. They gravitated toward more refined approaches to divine truth and revelation. They found Peter's visions uncomfortably vivid and theologically unsophisticated and naive. These educated critics would eventually contribute significantly to turning opinion against the text over time. But for multiple decades, Alexandria remained the Apocalypse of Peter's strongest fortress and center of support. The city's extensive networks of believers, scribes, and teachers guaranteed its survival during periods when other regions began expressing doubt. Alexandria had always functioned as a place where dangerous ideas discovered welcome reception. The Apocalypse of Peter represented simply the latest example of this ancient, ongoing tradition. The case for inclusion. The year 200 brought unusual excitement and energy to Christian communities dispersed across the empire. Bishops, teachers, and ordinary believers alike sensed they occupied a pivotal crossroads moment. The faith that had originated with a small group of fishermen and tax collectors now counted membership in the hundreds of thousands. But with exponential growth arrived questions demanding urgent answers. Which books truly originated from the apostles themselves? What texts deserved placement alongside the Hebrew scriptures their Jewish ancestors had carefully preserved and transmitted? The Apocalypse of Peter entered these crucial discussions, carrying impressive credentials and endorsements. Its title made claims of apostolic authorship. It linked directly to the fishermen who had walked alongside Jesus during his earthly ministry. Early copies circulated accompanied by testimonies from respected church leaders who personally vouched for its authenticity. The text itself communicated with prophetic authority. It offered detailed revelations regarding humanity's final destiny and ultimate fate. Bishop Clement of Alexandria emerged as among the text's most vocal and influential supporters. His reputation for both learning and piety carried substantial weight throughout the Christian world. Clement had pursued study of both pagan philosophy and Christian scripture. This gave him unique insight into distinguishing truth from error and deception. When he publicly endorsed the Apocalypse of Peter as genuine apostolic teaching, many believers took careful notice. Clement's arguments favoring inclusion rested upon several sturdy pillars of reasoning. The text's moral teachings aligned seamlessly with other accepted Christian writings already in circulation. Its emphasis on righteous living and divine justice echoed themes prominently found in Matthew's Gospel and Paul's collected letters. The detailed descriptions of future punishment served practical purposes. They encouraged believers to resist temptation and persevere faithfully through persecution and hardship. The Muratorian fragment, representing a list of accepted Christian books compiled around the year 200, included the Apocalypse of Peter, positioned alongside Gospels and epistles that later generations would regard as unquestionably canonical scripture. This early recognition suggested broad acceptance prevailing among church leaders of that particular time. The text appeared to have successfully passed whatever tests early Christians employed to evaluate religious writings. Other influential voices joined the growing chorus of support and endorsement. Methodius of Olympus offered praise for the text's vivid portrayal of divine justice in operation. Eusebius himself, despite later reservations he would develop, initially acknowledged its widespread popularity and apostolic claims. Teachers in Christian schools throughout various regions employed passages from the Apocalypse of Peter to illustrate moral lessons clearly. They treated it as scripture worthy of serious study and memorization. The text's supporters placed emphasis on its practical value for guiding Christian living in daily life. Unlike abstract theological treatises that remained inaccessible to ordinary people, the Apocalypse of Peter delivered concrete images that common believers could readily understand and retain in memory. A merchant facing temptation to cheat customers might vividly recall Peter's description of the greedy hanging by their tongues, suspended over lakes of fire. A parent struggling to discipline children effectively could point to the text's warnings regarding those who disobey divine authority established over them. Archaeological evidence recovered from early Christian archaeological sites provides support for the text's widespread acceptance across diverse regions. Fragments of the Apocalypse of Peter have been discovered in locations scattered across the Mediterranean world. This suggests active copying and distribution networks operating efficiently. Some manuscripts display clear signs of heavy, repeated use. This indicates regular reading occurring in worship settings or personal devotional practices. The text additionally gains support through its connection to other respected apocalyptic writings already valued. Christians already treasured the revelation of John, despite its challenging symbolism and mysterious, enigmatic imagery. The Apocalypse of Peter offered a companion vision, filling conspicuous gaps in understanding regarding the afterlife that John's text left unexplored and unanswered. Together, the two texts seem to provide a complete, comprehensive picture of humanity's ultimate destiny and eternal fate. Political considerations also created favorable conditions for inclusion during this period. The Roman Empire continued persecuting Christians sporadically across different regions. This created ongoing pressure to maintain unity and orthodox belief among scattered communities. Texts that emphasized divine judgment against the wicked brought comfort to believers suffering under imperial oppression and violence. The Apocalypse of Peter delivered promise that earthly injustices would ultimately be corrected in the world yet to come. Liturgical use supplied another compelling argument, favoring canonization and official acceptance. Several Christian communities incorporated readings drawn from the Apocalypse of Peter into their structured worship services. This occurred particularly during seasons focused on repentance and preparation for Christ's anticipated return. This practical acceptance suggested that ordinary believers discovered the text spiritually nourishing and doctrinally sound for building faith. The momentum favoring inclusion appeared unstoppable during the early 3rd century. Respected bishops publicly endorsed the text. Scholars mounted defenses of its authenticity and apostolic origin. Believers dispersed across the empire treasured its teachings and insights. The Apocalypse of Peter seemed destined to secure permanent placement among the collection of books that would define Christian faith for all future generations to come. But appearances, precisely as the text itself had warned readers, can prove deceiving and misleading. The case for exclusion. The tide began shifting in unexpected ways that caught supporters off guard. Bishop Serapion of Antioch stood before his congregation one particular morning. His face appeared grave, with deep concern and worry. Word had reached him regarding a church in nearby Rossus that had been reading from the Gospel of Peter during regular worship services. Initially, Serapion had approved the practice without hesitation. He trusted the apostolic name attached to the text. But deeper investigation uncovered troubling doctrinal problems that forced him to reverse his position and withdraw approval. This incident, carefully recorded in church history, marked a significant turning point in attitudes toward Petrine literature bearing Peter's name. If one text claiming Peter's authorship could potentially mislead believers into error, perhaps others deserved closer, more careful scrutiny and examination. The Apocalypse of Peter, despite its established popularity, found itself caught directly in this wave of suspicion regarding pseudepigraphic writings making false authorship claims. Theological objections multiplied as scholars subjected the text to more careful, rigorous examination. The crude descriptions of punishment seemed beneath the dignity properly befitting divine revelation from God. Critics argued persuasively that God's justice operated primarily through spiritual transformation instead of physical torture and pain. The Apocalypse of Peter's graphic imagery reduced complex theological concepts into simple cause and effect relationships. Sophisticated believers found this intellectually unsatisfying and theologically inadequate. Questions surrounding authorship proved particularly damaging to the text's credibility and standing. Advanced textual analysis revealed linguistic patterns inconsistent with first-century Palestinian origins. The Greek displayed influences from later historical periods and different geographical regions entirely. Scholars who had initially accepted Petrine authorship without question began expressing doubt. They questioned whether the historical Peter could realistically have produced such a literary work. The text's moral framework also attracted criticism from unexpected quarters and voices. Some church leaders worried intensely that its emphasis on punishment through fear instead of love contradicted core Christian teachings regarding divine mercy and redemption. The Apocalypse of Peter appeared to encourage believers to avoid sin primarily to escape painful consequences. This differed from growing in holiness and compassion, motivated by love. Doctrinal concerns multiplied steadily as theological understanding developed greater sophistication and nuance. The text's anthropology, meaning its understanding of human nature, appeared overly simplistic to teachers grappling with complex questions. These involved the soul, resurrection of the body, and eternal destiny of humanity. Its eschatology, the teaching about end times, seemed to conflict with more nuanced interpretations developing. These concerned Christ's second coming and final judgment of all creation. Regional variations in Christian practice created additional significant problems for the apocalypse of Peter's canonical status. Churches in different geographical areas had cultivated distinct traditions. These governed which texts to read in worship and use for instruction. The text maintained popularity in some regions while simultaneously falling out of favor in other areas. This geographical division undermined claims about its universal acceptance and apostolic authority recognized everywhere. The rise of Montanism, a charismatic movement emphasizing new prophecies and strict moral discipline, inadvertently damaged the apocalypse of Peter's reputation substantially. Montanists enthusiastically embraced the text's harsh moral tone and detailed prophetic visions. They used it to support their own controversial teachings facing opposition. Mainstream church leaders, already suspicious of Montanist excesses and extremism, began viewing the apocalypse of Peter as potentially dangerous to orthodox faith and practice. Literary criticism contributed significantly to growing doubts about the text's value and merit. Educated Christians compared it unfavorably to the revelation of John. They found Peter's visions less sophisticated in their symbolism and theological insight. The apocalypse of Peter seemed to appeal primarily to simple believers. These preferred concrete imagery over deeper spiritual truths, requiring interpretation and contemplation. Practical concerns about the text's effects on Christian behavior also emerged among church leaders. Some noticed that communities emphasizing the apocalypse of Peter developed unhealthy preoccupations. These focused excessively on sin and punishment instead of grace and growth. Instead of producing joy and spiritual maturity, the text seemed to generate anxiety. It promoted legalistic approaches to faith that hindered rather than helped Christian development. The growing influence of Alexandrian theology created an intellectual climate increasingly hostile to the text. This theology emphasized spiritual rather than literal interpretation of Scripture. Scholars like Origen strongly preferred texts that yielded rich allegorical meanings. They valued hidden depths over simple moral lessons available to all. The apocalypse of Peter seemed too obvious, too lacking in layered meanings to satisfy sophisticated theological inquiry and study. Economic factors may have played a role in the text's gradual decline and marginalization. The considerable expense of copying manuscripts meant that Christian communities had to make difficult choices. They had to decide which books to preserve and transmit to future generations. As doubts grew regarding the apocalypse of Peter's authenticity and overall value, scribes and patrons began investing their limited resources elsewhere. They chose texts with stronger claims to apostolic authority and theological importance. The case for exclusion gained momentum through cumulative effect, rather than any single decisive argument. Multiple concerns combined to create doubt, where once there had been confidence and certainty. The apocalypse of Peter's supporters found themselves fighting on too many fronts simultaneously. They were unable to adequately address all the objections raised against their beloved text. Eusebius and the power to erase. History remembers Eusebius of Caesarea as the father of church history. But his true power lay in shaping which memories would survive for future generations. In his great work, the Ecclesiastical History, completed around the year 325, this scholarly bishop created categories that would determine the fate of countless Christian texts for centuries to come. His pen became a sword that could elevate writings to sacred status or consign them to the shadows of doubt and obscurity. Eusebius divided Christian literature into four careful, distinct categories. The accepted books included the four Gospels, Paul's collected letters, and other texts that enjoyed universal recognition across Christian communities. The disputed books had gained some support, but faced questions about authenticity or doctrinal soundness. The spurious writings bore names of apostles, but clearly came from later authors making false claims. The heretical books promoted false teachings that threatened orthodox faith and endangered souls. The Apocalypse of Peter found itself placed firmly in the disputed category. This classification carried the weight of scholarly authority throughout the entire Christian world. Eusebius acknowledged the text's historical popularity and the support it had received. Yet he simultaneously expressed reservations about its ultimate value for the Church. This measured judgment reflected his careful methodology and scholarly approach, but it also sealed the text's fate in ways he may not have fully anticipated or intended. Eusebius had access to collections of books and historical records that very few of his peers could even dream of reaching. Being the bishop of Caesarea provided him with connections spanning Christian communities throughout the Eastern Empire. He was able to examine ancient manuscripts, speak with older believers who remembered earlier times, and follow how sacred writings had been passed down across several generations. This thorough investigation gave his opinions remarkable weight among church authorities who were looking for direction concerning writings that sparked debate. The personal theological leanings of this historian shaped his assessments in ways that were subtle yet deeply important. Eusebius showed preference for writings that aligned with imperial Christianity's focus on structure, leadership, and cohesion. The vivid and shocking imagery found in Peter's Apocalypse, along with its attraction to everyday religious feelings, created discomfort for him. He felt more drawn to the complex symbolism present in John's revelation and the theological richness found in Paul's correspondence. Eusebius was also forced to work within the political circumstances of his era. Emperor Constantine had only recently embraced Christianity, bringing an end to hundreds of years of persecution, yet this also introduced fresh demands for religious conformity. Church gatherings were starting to tackle doctrinal disagreements that put Christian unity at risk. Within this setting, writings such as the Apocalypse of Peter appeared more likely to cause division than to help forge agreement. This historian's impact reached well past his own years of life because his writings were copied and kept safe. Scribes, working in medieval times, regarded Eusebius as the highest authority when it came to early Christian writings. The categories he created became the standard points of reference for deciding which writings deserved careful study and which ones could be safely set aside. The label of disputed that was attached to the Apocalypse of Peter made scribes less willing to copy and share it, which over time proved increasingly deadly for the text's survival. Geographic variations in how manuscripts were preserved made Eusebius's influence even stronger. Communities located in the Eastern Empire, where his authority carried the most weight, slowly gave up on writings he had raised doubts about. Churches in the West held onto some disputed writings for a longer period, yet they eventually followed Eastern examples in most situations. The Apocalypse of Peter lasted longer in Egypt and Syria than it did in Greece or Asia Minor, yet even these remaining strongholds eventually gave in to the growing scholarly agreement. The methods Eusebius used, although remarkable for his time period, held biases that contemporary scholars can now identify, but ancient readers simply accepted without raising questions. He gave more importance to written evidence than to spoken tradition, valued formal theological discussion over popular religious expression, and trusted institutional authority more than widespread acceptance by ordinary believers. These tendencies worked against writings like the Apocalypse of Peter that had flourished in different settings. How this historian dealt with apocalyptic writings mirrored larger transformations happening in Christian intellectual culture. The Church was shifting away from expecting immediate divine action toward finding ways to work within existing social and political frameworks. Vivid descriptions of divine judgment felt less meaningful to Christians who were starting to hold earthly power for themselves. Eusebius represented this transformation through his scholarly choices and his decisions about what should be considered canonical. Financial realities strengthened the impact of Eusebius's scholarly influence. Making copies of manuscripts stayed expensive and labor-intensive all through ancient and medieval times. Christian communities faced difficult choices about which writings to protect and pass along. Once Eusebius had marked the Apocalypse of Peter as disputed, those who funded manuscript copying and the scribes who did the work naturally gave priority to writings that had stronger scholarly support. The strange twist in Eusebius's influence comes from results he never intended. Through developing organized systems for judging Christian literature, he created instruments that scholars who came later could use to challenge his own conclusions. Modern findings of ancient manuscripts have shown just how popular and influential some writings were that he pushed aside or dismissed. The Apocalypse of Peter has discovered fresh life, specifically because scholars today have recognized the shortcomings of decisions about canon made in the 4th century. Eusebius used his writing instrument with deliberate care, yet the building effect of his decisions reshaped Christian collective memory in ways that still shape religious understanding in our time. The writings he protected became scripture, while those he questioned disappeared into footnotes that only scholars remember. His categories appeared neutral and objective, but they held the complete force of imperial Christianity's developing orthodoxy. The Apocalypse of Peter turned into a victim of this mechanism, neither heretical enough to spark intense resistance, nor accepted enough to guarantee its preservation. Hell transforms over time. The medieval consciousness had a craving for divine retribution that would have made even the person who wrote the Apocalypse of Peter take notice. Yet, where the ancient writing provided straightforward moral formulas, Christians who came later wanted intricate theological frameworks that could chart the landscape of eternal damnation with something approaching scientific accuracy. Hell shifted from Peter's direct vision into something much more elaborate and frightening. Dante Alighieri sat in his study on a winter evening in 1308 with manuscripts spread around him and memories of being forced out of his city for political reasons. He had watched everything he once cherished slip away. His home city, his social standing, his confidence about divine fairness. The inferno that flowed from his pen during the years that followed would reshape Christian imagination more thoroughly than any writing since the New Testament came into being. Still, echoes of the Apocalypse of Peter murmured through his precisely constructed levels of punishment. The link between Peter's visions and Dante's great work goes beyond simple literary borrowing. Both writings attempted to transform abstract ideas about divine fairness into something solid and unforgettable. Both writers grasped that moral teaching needed powerful imagery that would stay in readers' thoughts well after they finished reading. Both understood that although fear of punishment might not be the noblest reason for living righteously, it stayed a forceful instrument for influencing human actions. Theologians in medieval times had organized punishment in ways that would have shocked early Christians. They built exact classifications for various kinds of wrongdoing, connecting each violation with fitting eternal results. The Apocalypse of Peter's comparatively basic list of torments was replaced by detailed plans that took into account every conceivable moral mistake with mathematical exactness. Thomas Aquinas brought philosophical discipline to conversations about eternal punishment that raised speculation to the status of systematic theology. His Summa Theologica gave thoughtful consideration to matters concerning the character of hellish suffering, how spiritual and physical punishment relate to each other, and whether eternal results for temporary wrongdoing could be just. These scholarly conversations moved well beyond the striking yet unsophisticated imagery of the Apocalypse of Peter. Art and building design brought hell's transformation into popular awareness through paths that touched believers who never opened theological writings. Cathedral carvings showed the condemned with growing graphic precision, while decorated manuscripts offered close views of punishment that made Peter's visions appear almost restrained in comparison. The Last Judgment turned into a preferred topic for artists who tried to outdo each other, creating the most striking depictions of divine anger. Mystery plays made hell come alive on medieval platforms with mechanical creativity that thrilled audiences seeking dramatic displays. Complex stage machinery gave the appearance of actual flames and smoke, while performers dressed as demons tormented the evil with theatrical energy. These shows transformed the abstract ideas of eternal punishment into something immediate and captivating in ways that ancient writings could never accomplish. The Black Death of the 14th century made Christian concern with death and judgment more intense in ways that found fresh audiences for writings about hell. Those who survived the plague looked for purpose in their pain and confidence that divine fairness would finally win out. Writings describing punishment of evil people offered mental relief to believers working to make sense of why God had allowed such widespread destruction. Purgatory appeared as a theological development that dealt with practical pastoral worries about what happened to average believers who died neither completely good nor entirely bad. This in-between condition needed its own geography and inhabitants, resulting in detailed descriptions that existed alongside but did not replace traditional hell. The apocalypse of Peter's simple separation between the saved and the damned appeared increasingly insufficient for handling complicated moral circumstances. Renaissance humanism brought fresh viewpoints on human worth that created conflict with traditional focus on punishment and divine anger. Scholars rediscovering classical writings discovered Greek and Roman ways of thinking about ethics that highlighted virtue instead of fear as the main reason for good conduct. These influences slowly weakened the cultural supports that had sustained writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. Protestant reformers kept their belief in hell, while turning away from many medieval editions as speculation without scriptural basis. Martin Luther and John Calvin stressed divine sovereignty and human sinfulness in ways that made eternal punishment appear both essential and fair. Yet they liked biblical imagery better than the creative expansions that had marked medieval handling of the topic. The printing press made literature about punishment and damnation available to more people, while at the same time making it simpler for those who disagreed to compare various writings and spot contradictions. Readers could at this point look at several descriptions of hell next to each other, observing inconsistencies and raising doubts about traditional authorities. The Apocalypse of Peter's fairly simple method started to appear crude when compared to more advanced options. Scientific progress produced fresh obstacles for understanding physical punishment in hell as literally true. Better knowledge of anatomy, physics, and geography made traditional descriptions appear increasingly hard to believe to educated believers. Theologians answered by stressing spiritual instead of physical parts of eternal punishment, moving themselves further from the solid imagery that had made the Apocalypse of Peter gripping to ancient audiences. Modern psychology has reinterpreted traditional worries about guilt and punishment in ways that make ancient apocalyptic writings appear mentally harmful instead of spiritually helpful. Contemporary Christians frequently see focus on fear and punishment as barriers to spiritual development instead of supports for moral growth. The Apocalypse of Peter's teaching method clashes with therapeutic approaches to religious formation that control current pastoral work. Hell keeps transforming in popular culture through books, movies, and digital platforms that adjust traditional ideas for today's audiences. Yet these current treatments usually stress entertainment worth over moral teaching, flipping the priorities that drove ancient apocalyptic writers. The Apocalypse of Peter's genuine worry about righteousness appears almost charming when compared to present ways of handling imagery about hell. The lost forms of Christianity. In the concealed spaces of ancient libraries, overlooked voices speak softly about possibilities that might have existed. Christianity, as we recognize it, stands for just one branch of an enormous tree that once developed in numerous directions. The Apocalypse of Peter exists as proof of paths that were never followed, possibilities that were real before councils and emperors chose which form of faith would continue. The very first Christian communities looked more like a busy marketplace than a single united movement. Those who followed Jesus met in house churches, spread out across the Mediterranean region, each group forming its own grasp of their teacher's lessons. Some highlighted his divine nature, while others concentrated on his humanity. Some valued his moral guidance, while others pursued mystical connection with his spirit. The Apocalypse of Peter came out of this creative disorder, presenting one community's understanding of ultimate truth. Gnostic Christians claimed secret wisdom that offered freedom from the physical world's restrictions. Their writings portrayed a complicated spiritual cosmos full of divine emanations and cosmic battles between light and darkness. The Apocalypse of Peter appeared rough and too focused on material things to believers who wanted escape from physical existence instead of its transformation through divine judgment. Jewish Christians kept attending synagogue worship while recognizing Jesus as Messiah, building a hybrid faith that respected both traditions. They observed dietary rules, kept the Sabbath rest, and asked male converts to undergo circumcision. The Apocalypse of Peter's focus on moral conduct connected with their concern for living righteously, yet its Gentile creation and Greek cultural foundations reduced its attraction within their communities. Marcionite churches turned their backs on the Hebrew scriptures completely, treating the Old Testament God as a separate deity from the loving Father that Jesus revealed. They formed their own collection of sacred writings, made up only of Luke's Gospel and Paul's letters, after editing them to take out Jewish influences. The Apocalypse of Peter's vivid descriptions of punishment appeared to show the severe justice of the Hebrew God they had turned away from, instead of the mercy of the Christian Father they honored. Montanist communities anticipated fresh prophecies to add to the revelations given to the first apostles. They followed strict moral rules and got ready for Christ's coming return to set up his earthly kingdom. The Apocalypse of Peter's prophetic manner and specific eschatology attracted believers who valued continuing divine messages, yet its connection to an ancient apostle clashed with their focus on current spiritual gifts. Ebionite Christians saw Jesus as a human prophet instead of divine rescuer, stressing his position as instructor and model instead of cosmic savior. They lived simply by choice and shared possessions while keeping Jewish ritual practices. The Apocalypse of Peter's moral instruction matched their beliefs, yet its supernatural parts appeared at odds with their rational way of approaching religious truth. Docetic believers taught that Christ only seemed to possess a physical body, claiming that divine spirit could not really combine with corrupt matter. They stressed Jesus' heavenly source and eternal character while downplaying his human experiences. The Apocalypse of Peter's solid imagery of physical punishment and rising from death appeared to go against their grasp of reality as basically spiritual instead of material. Each Christian community had its own group of sacred writings that showed specific theological viewpoints and practical needs. Country churches valued simple moral guidance, while city congregations liked complex theological works. Rich sponsors paid for copying of writings that backed their social positions, while persecuted minorities kept writings that brought comfort in hardship. The mechanism of deciding what was canonical involved political and financial elements that had minimal connection to spiritual truth or apostolic authority. Bishops with imperial ties could advance their chosen writings while pushing aside options. Rich churches had resources to copy and spread their selected scriptures, while poorer communities had to take whatever manuscripts they could get. Geographic variations in Christian practice formed islands of diversity that kept alternative traditions alive long after they had vanished in other places. The Apocalypse of Peter kept areas of support in Egypt and Syria while disappearing from memory in Greece and Italy. These geographic differences showed local theological choices and cultural expectations instead of fair assessments of textual authority. Archaeological findings keep showing the variety of early Christian belief and practice in ways that push back against traditional stories about orthodox growth. Papyrus pieces keep writings that people thought had been entirely lost, while carved inscriptions record communities that practice different rituals and theological teachings than those talked about in surviving writings. The silencing of alternative forms of Christianity involved both active persecution and passive disregard. Church leaders spoke out against heretical teachings while refusing to copy or protect disputed writings. Economic forces reinforce theological decisions as communities put limited resources into manuscripts that had official approval instead of those marked by scholarly doubt. Bringing back these lost voices takes careful archaeological and literary detective work that assembles fragmentary proof from various sources. The Apocalypse of Peter only survived because desert sands protect papyrus pieces that might otherwise have fallen apart into dust. Most alternative Christian writings likely vanished without leaving any mark in the historical record. Modern Christianity could have grown very differently if political situations had supported different theological traditions, or if financial factors had protected alternative collections of writings. The Apocalypse of Peter's striking moral imagery could have influenced Christian art and books in ways that would appear normal instead of strange to today's believers. Matters about canonical authority could have been settled through different standards that prized popular acceptance over scholarly approval. The lost forms of Christianity show us that religious traditions grow through historical mechanisms that include human decisions instead of unavoidable divine direction. The writings that make it through canonization show the likes and dislikes of specific communities at particular moments in history. The Apocalypse of Peter's removal from the biblical canon reveals as much about Christianity in the 4th century as it reveals about the writing itself. Finding it again, and modern surprise. The winter of 1886 delivered more than seasonal cold weather to French archaeologist Urbain Bourriant at his digging location near Akhmim, Egypt. Within a tomb that had shielded its contents from hundreds of years of desert windstorms, his crew found a leather-bound codex holding writings that scholarship had long thought lost for all time. Within these ancient valuables lay pieces of the Apocalypse of Peter, waiting to surprise the modern world with visions that had frightened and motivated believers 1,500 years before. Bourriant's first look at the manuscript showed writing in Greek that appeared both recognizable and shocking. The writing claimed apostolic authority, while describing scenes of divine punishment that went beyond anything in the accepted biblical canon. Early translations moved among European scholars who reacted with combinations of interest and disgust to descriptions they had known only through second-hand mentions in ancient church histories. The academic world of the late 19th century had limited experience with Christian literature outside the canon. Scholars had concentrated mainly on creating reliable versions of biblical books instead of investigating the wider variety of early Christian writing. The finding of the Apocalypse of Peter created windows into a religious world that appeared both more intricate and more troubling than traditional histories had indicated. Protestant scholars discovered themselves in an uncomfortable situation when facing the newly found writing. Their traditions stressed biblical authority while turning away from later additions to the apostolic witness. The Apocalypse of Peter claimed ancient credentials while holding material that appeared to go against their grasp of Christian teaching. This conflict pushed uncomfortable matters about how canonical choices had been made and whether they could be changed. Catholic researchers came to the finding with different starting points but similar confusion. Their tradition recognized the authority of church councils and papal choices in setting canonical limits. The Apocalypse of Peter had been clearly rejected by early church authorities, which made its contents historically interesting yet theologically beside the point. Still, the writing's striking imagery and moral worries connected with Catholic traditions of art and devotion in ways that made simple dismissal complicated. German higher criticism had gotten some scholars ready to anticipate variety and growth in early Christian writings. These researchers saw the Apocalypse of Peter as helpful proof for grasping how Christian communities had understood Jesus' teachings in various historical settings. They highlighted historical examination over theological decision, handling the writing as a window into ancient religious awareness instead of a possible source of current spiritual authority. Public response to newspaper reports of the finding showed widespread interest in apocalyptic ideas that respectable Christianity had attempted to reduce or spiritualize. Newspaper stories of Peter's visions drew readers hungry for solid details about the afterlife that their pastors usually avoided talking about. The writing's vivid imagery appeared to fulfill curiosity about ultimate matters that modern theology had left purposely unclear. Comparative religion scholars discovered in the Apocalypse of Peter proof for theories about how religious ideas develop across various cultures and historical time periods. They observed similarities between Peter's descriptions of punishment and comparable ideas in Egyptian, Persian, and Greek traditions. These links hinted that Christian apocalyptic writings had taken from older sources while changing their content for fresh theological aims. Art historians identified visual patterns in medieval Christian art that appeared to match descriptions discovered in the newly found writing. Cathedral carvings and decorated manuscripts hold details that fit the Apocalypse of Peter's imagery more precisely than anything in the canonical Bible. This finding hinted that the ancient writing had shaped Christian artistic tradition even after its removal from official scripture. Psychological understandings of the writing stressed its showing of human worries about moral mistakes and divine judgment that went beyond specific historical times. Sigmund Freud and other pioneers of depth psychology found in Peter's visions proof for unconscious fears and wants that influenced religious expression across cultures. The writing's draw appeared to show universal psychological requirements instead of specifically Christian theological worries. Literary critics positioned the Apocalypse of Peter within the wider tradition of visionary writings that included Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. They observed how ancient Christian writers had used comparable methods of moral instruction through striking imagery that modern writers kept using for various purposes. The writing appeared to stand for a significant connection in the growth of Western literary tradition. Archaeological findings in Egypt kept producing more pieces and complete manuscripts that broadened scholarly grasp of early Christian variety. The Nag Hammadi Library, found in 1945, held dozens of writings that had been lost for more than 1,000 years. These discoveries built fresh recognition for the complexity of ancient Christianity, while bringing up matters about which voices had been quieted in the mechanism of canonical formation. Feminist scholars discovered in writings like the Apocalypse of Peter proof for women's involvement in early Christian communities that later orthodoxy had reduced or wiped out. While the writing itself showed patriarchal expectations common to its era, the simple fact of its preservation hinted at networks of believers that included women as teachers, copyists, and spiritual authorities. Digital humanities projects have made the Apocalypse of Peter reachable to global audiences in ways that would have been impossible for earlier generations of scholars. Online databases offer several translations, while hyperlinked notes link the writing to related materials and current scholarship. These technological improvements have made access to ancient Christian writings available to everyone, while building fresh possibilities for comparative examination and understanding. The rediscovery of the Apocalypse of Peter keeps producing scholarly discussion about the limits of early Christianity and the standards used for deciding canonical authority. Some researchers push for inclusive methods that prize variety and historical accident, while others insist that theological quality and apostolic genuineness offer necessary measures for separating authentic from false traditions. The psychology of fear. Fear has a strange ability to concentrate the human mind on ultimate matters that wealth and ease let us ignore. The early Christians who accepted the Apocalypse of Peter lived in a world where death showed up without notice, and fairness appeared constantly postponed. Their draw to specific descriptions of divine punishment showed psychological requirements that went beyond simple morbid interest or primitive superstition. Terror worked as instructor in ways that gentle teaching could not equal. A merchant considering using dishonest weights could forget abstract lessons about honesty, yet vivid pictures of cheaters dangling by their tongues over pools of fire built memories that would come to mind at important moments of moral choice. The Apocalypse of Peter grasped that ethical conduct frequently depends more on imagination than on logic. Ancient minds worked within structures of honor and disgrace that made public humiliation appear worse than private pain. The writing's stress on exposure and recognition in the afterlife attracted believers who grasped reputation as more precious than life itself. The possibility of eternal shame before divine and human observers offered motivation that went beyond fear of physical pain alone. Guilt needed solid expression to turn into something psychologically controllable for people who did not have modern therapeutic language. The Apocalypse of Peter provided specific punishments that fit specific wrongdoings in ways that let believers picture their own moral mistakes and imagine fitting results. This match between crime and punishment offered psychological relief through the guarantee that fairness would finally win out. Social management worked through fear more successfully than through positive rewards in communities where resources stayed limited and competition strong. The writing's specific list of punishments helped community leaders who required instruments for keeping order and discipline. Warnings of eternal results held importance that temporary penalties could not match, particularly among believers who anticipated Christ's return within their lifetimes. Childhood experiences of punishment and reward built psychological patterns that made adult believers open to comparable structures in religious settings. The Apocalypse of Peter spoke to people who had learned moral lessons through physical discipline and social criticism. Its imagery connected with memories of parental authority and communal judgment that influenced their grasp of divine governance. Trauma from persecution and social exclusion built psychological injuries that needed explanation and relief. The writing's guarantee that current sufferers would observe their oppressor's punishment offered emotional restoration for believers who worked to keep faith despite continuing hardship. Visions of divine fairness provided hope that present situations did not show ultimate reality or lasting conditions. Group identity building gained from shared fears that separated insiders from outsiders while building solidarity among community members. The Apocalypse of Peter offered common language and imagery that let believers identify each other while keeping boundaries against threatening external forces. Collective terror turned into a source of connection instead of separation. Psychological projection let believers move personal worries onto external enemies while keeping positive self-images. The writing's judgment of specific wrongdoings helped readers identify themselves with the righteous while seeing their opponents as headed for punishment. This mechanism shielded fragile egos while strengthening community loyalty and doctrinal dedication. Ritual cleansing practices gained purpose through fear of spiritual pollution that the writing described in vivid detail. Believers who could otherwise see baptism, fasting, or confession as hollow ceremonies discovered deeper importance when they grasped these practices as defense against eternal results. Fear changed routine religious activities into desperate requirements for spiritual survival. Conversion experiences frequently include dramatic movements from terror to relief as potential believers shifted from identification with the condemned to confidence of salvation. The Apocalypse of Peter offered before and after stories that assisted converts in grasping their spiritual change in solid terms. The writing's imagery provided emotional importance to abstract theological ideas about justification and redemption. Memory methods in oral cultures depended heavily on emotional links to keep significant information across generations. The writing's disturbing descriptions built unforgettable mental pictures that passed along moral lessons more successfully than organized ethical instruction. Fear turned into a teaching instrument that helped communities without widespread ability to read or formal educational organizations. Dreams and visions regularly brought in parts from religious writings that believers had memorized or heard over and over. The Apocalypse of Peter's striking imagery showed up in personal spiritual experiences that appeared to validate the writing's authority and significance. These psychological occurrences built feedback loops that strengthened belief in the writing's divine inspiration and prophetic correctness. Seasonal patterns of worry and celebration discovered expression through religious practices that stressed either judgment or mercy, depending on liturgical setting. The writing offered suitable readings for penitential seasons, when communities concentrated on moral examination and spiritual discipline. Fear worked as getting ready for joy instead of a goal in itself within these thoughtfully organized religious calendars. Mental illness in ancient settings frequently showed itself through religious language and imagery that showed the person's cultural background and spiritual worries. The Apocalypse of Peter's descriptions of punishment might have shaped how some believers experienced and expressed psychological pain. Communities that stressed divine judgment could have accidentally made worse instead of relieved emotional pain among weak members. Authority frameworks within Christian communities gained acceptance through connection with divine judgment that the writing described in gripping detail. Leaders who claimed apostolic succession or prophetic gifts could refer to Peter's visions as proof for their spiritual authority. Fear of eternal punishment made believers more ready to accept human direction and submit to institutional discipline. Therapeutic roles of religious fear worked through managed exposure to worry, creating imagery within supportive community settings. The writing let believers face their deepest terrors about death and judgment while surrounded by fellow believers who had comparable worries. This collective handling of existential worry offered psychological advantages that individual thinking could not reach. Cognitive dissonance between lived experience and religious guarantees built internal conflict that needed psychological settlement. When believers suffered while their enemies thrived, the Apocalypse of Peter provided explanations that kept faith by pushing justice into the future. This time-based displacement let communities keep hope despite proof that appeared to go against divine providence. Echoes in art and culture. The great cathedral of Autun rose from French ground in the 12th century, its stones carved with pictures that would have made the writer of the Apocalypse of Peter satisfied. Over the main entrance, Gislebertus sculpted a last judgment scene where the condemned twisted in torments, strikingly comparable to those described in the ancient writing. Demons pulled sinners toward gaping jaws of hell, while angels measured souls with divine exactness. The medieval artist had never opened Peter's visions. Yet his chisel appeared directed by the same moral imagination that had influenced the ancient apocalypse. Gothic cathedrals throughout Europe turned into galleries of instruction about hell, where Peter's influence murmured through stone and glass. Chartres, Notre Dame, Amiens. Each magnificent building brought in visual parts that matched the writing's organized way of thinking about divine punishment. Rich sponsors funded these enormous projects, partly to teach believers who could not read about moral results that sermons alone could not communicate successfully. Illuminated manuscripts kept Peter's imagery in more personal settings, where individual readers could examine detailed showings of punishment and redemption. Books of Hours held miniature paintings that carried the writer's visions into private devotional practices. Noble families valued these artistic valuables that mixed spiritual instruction with aesthetic satisfaction, making moral lessons beautiful and memorable. Mystery plays changed Peter's still descriptions into active theatrical shows that involved audiences through several senses at once. Performers dressed as demons used mechanical tools to copy the punishments described in ancient apocalyptic writings. These productions transformed abstract theological ideas into something immediate and captivating while keeping traditional moral teachings for populations who could not read. Dante's Divine Comedy stands for the most advanced artistic change of ideas that started in writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. The Italian poet built an organized geography of the afterlife that went beyond ancient visions in both literary quality and theological depth. Still, marks of Peter's influence show up throughout the Inferno's thoughtfully built punishments that fit specific wrongdoings with suitable results. Renaissance artists kept drawing inspiration from apocalyptic imagery while adjusting traditional ideas for fresh aesthetic feelings. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel fresco mixed classical artistic methods with Christian moral instruction that would have been recognizable to readers of the Apocalypse of Peter. The artist's forceful figures embodied spiritual truths in visual forms that went beyond specific historical times or cultural settings. Protestant Reformation built fresh conflicts around religious art that had traditionally brought in apocalyptic ideas. Reformed churches turned away from complex visual programs as possible sources of idolatry while keeping belief in divine judgment and eternal punishment. This theological movement reduced artistic expression of ideas that the Apocalypse of Peter had assisted in establishing in Christian imagination. Baroque artists like Hieronymus Bosch pushed apocalyptic imagery to fresh extremes of fantasy and horror that went beyond even the Apocalypse of Peter's vivid descriptions. The Garden of Earthly Delights and comparable works built surreal landscapes of wrongdoing and punishment that showed both traditional Christian ideas and individual artistic vision. These masterpieces showed the continued draw of moral instruction through shocking visual imagery. Literature kept adjusting apocalyptic ideas for fresh audiences and purposes all through the modern time period. John Milton's Paradise Lost, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and numerous other works pulled from traditions that went back to ancient writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. These writers changed primitive moral instruction into advanced artistic expression while keeping essential parts of the original vision. Folk traditions kept apocalyptic imagery through oral stories, songs, and customs that passed along moral lessons across generations without formal literary education. Country communities kept beliefs about divine judgment and eternal punishment that showed ancient worries, even when they did not have direct access to the writings that had first expressed these ideas. Cultural memory kept essential parts while adjusting surface details to local settings. Cinema found in apocalyptic ideas rich material for visual storytelling that could touch mass audiences with never-before-seen success. Films like The Seventh Seal, The Exorcist, and numerous others pulled from religious traditions that included influence from writings like The Apocalypse of Peter. These modern productions used advanced technical abilities to build pictures that went beyond ancient imaginations while doing comparable jobs of moral instruction and emotional catharsis. Digital media has built fresh possibilities for experiencing apocalyptic imagery through interactive games, virtual reality, and online communities that investigate ideas of judgment and redemption. These technological developments let today's audiences experience moral choices and their results in ways that would have astonished ancient believers who depended on still writings and oral instruction. Horror fiction. Discovered in apocalyptic traditions, rich sources of imagery and psychological understanding that could frighten modern readers while investigating fundamental matters about human character and moral responsibility. Writers like Clive Barker, Stephen King, and others built works that brought ancient worries about divine judgment up to date for today's audiences, who could turn away from traditional religious structures while staying interested in matters of ultimate fairness. Graphic novels and comic books adjusted apocalyptic ideas for visual storytelling that mixed literary narrative with artistic expression. These popular media forms touched audiences that could never come across traditional religious writings, while keeping essential parts of moral instruction through captivating and reachable presentations. Contemporary art installations have brought in apocalyptic imagery to comment on modern social and political matters while pulling from traditional religious symbolism that goes back to ancient writings. Artists use recognizable visual languages to share fresh messages about environmental destruction, social inequality, and other current worries that appear to call for prophetic warning and moral judgment. Music across different styles has kept pulling inspiration from apocalyptic ideas that started in writings like The Apocalypse of Peter. From medieval chant to modern metal, composers have discovered in these ancient visions material for artistic expression that connects with universal human worries about fairness, punishment, and redemption. The writing's influence echoes through hundreds of years of musical growth in ways that show its lasting psychological and spiritual significance. The forbidden door stays open. The ancient papyrus falls apart at the edges, its Greek letters disappearing into the desert sand from which modern archaeologists saved it more than 100 years ago. Still, something in the Apocalypse of Peter will not die. In university libraries and digital archives, behind locked doors of rare book collections, and concealed in plain sight on internet servers, Peter's visions keep whispering their uncomfortable truths to anyone courageous enough to pay attention. We prefer to think we have progressed beyond such primitive fears, that our advanced grasp of psychology and theology has released us from rough pictures of divine punishment. Our churches talk about love instead of anger, therapy instead of judgment, restoration instead of condemnation. We have tamed God, made the divine safe for suburban feelings and corporate mission statements. Yet late at night, when sleep stays away and conscience awakens, Peter's ancient terrors still hold the ability to trouble our thoughtfully built peace. The writing lasts because it talks to something deeper than theological advancement or cultural polish. It speaks to the human hunger for fairness that no amount of explaining away can completely fulfill. We observe evil, thriving, and innocent people suffering, then convince ourselves that moral results are simply social inventions or evolutionary adjustments. Yet Peter's visions demand that the universe holds a moral framework that will finally assert itself despite all appearances to the opposite. Modern horror fiction, from the understated psychological terror of Shirley Jackson to the vivid violence of today's cinema, pulls from the same source of worry that fed the Apocalypse of Peter. Our entertainment business has constructed whole categories around the idea that moral violations need to be punished, that fairness will at some point win out, that the evil cannot run from results forever. We have made Peter's vision secular while keeping its essential framework and emotional draw. Environmental destruction and climate change have built fresh settings for apocalyptic thinking that make ancient writings appear almost predictive. The Apocalypse of Peter's warnings about divine judgment discover echoes in current predictions about planetary disaster coming from human moral mistakes. We face the possibility that our species' ethical choices could decide our survival, providing fresh significance to ancient worries about ultimate results. Social media platforms have built digital spaces where moral judgment works, with the quick certainty that Peter's visions guaranteed. Online communities spot wrongdoers, gather collective punishment, and build reputational results that can ruin lives with striking efficiency. The internet has made the ability of moral enforcement available to everyone while taking away the mercy and forgiveness that traditional religious structures usually included next to their warnings about judgment. Psychological research keeps showing the ways that human beings need moral structures to keep mental health and social cooperation. We appear to require beliefs about fairness and results to work successfully in groups and discover purpose in individual existence. The Apocalypse of Peter grasped this requirement long before behavioral science could explain its evolutionary sources or neurological workings. Political movements throughout the ideological range regularly use apocalyptic language that matches ideas from ancient writings like the Apocalypse of Peter. Both progressive and conservative voices warn about moral breakdown, resulting in social collapse, spot specific wrongdoings that put communal survival at risk, and guarantee that fairness will finally win out over current unfairness. The writing's rhetorical approaches keep influencing public conversation in ways that most speakers and listeners never identify. Therapeutic ways of dealing with guilt and shame frequently work hard to offer the psychological settlement that more primitive frameworks of moral responsibility appeared to provide. Today's counseling highlights self-acceptance and forgiveness while sometimes leaving clients with unfinished feelings about their own moral mistakes. The Apocalypse of Peter's clear classifications and definite results offered psychological finality that modern therapeutic methods might not completely replace. Religious communities keep wrestling with matters about divine fairness and human responsibility that the Apocalypse of Peter dealt with in uncomfortably direct ways. Progressive denominations highlight God's love while working to keep moral standards, while conservative groups protect traditional language about judgment while adjusting to today's feelings. The writing exists as a reminder of Christianity's more challenging earlier expressions that will not separate mercy from fairness or love from moral result. Archaeological findings keep showing fresh pieces and related writings that broaden our grasp of early Christian variety, while bringing up matters about which voices were protected and which were quieted. The Apocalypse of Peter stands for thousands of comparable works that vanished when specific theological traditions obtained institutional authority. We can only wonder what other viewpoints were lost when the early church made its canonical choices. Digital humanities projects have made ancient writings reachable to global audiences while building fresh possibilities for comparative examination and understanding. Anyone with internet access can at this point open the Apocalypse of Peter and create their own decisions about its worth and significance. This making scholarly resources available to everyone has altered the landscape of religious authority while providing fresh life to forgotten writings. The forbidden door that 19th century archaeologists opened in the Egyptian desert can never be completely shut again. Peter's visions have joined today's awareness through several paths that guarantee their protection no matter what official religious approval or scholarly agreement says. The writing has turned into part of our cultural DNA, shaping art, books, psychology, and spirituality in ways that go beyond any specific theological structure. Perhaps the Apocalypse of Peter's biggest gift to modern readers exists not in its particular moral guidance or theological claims, but in its reminder that human beings have always worked with matters about fairness, purpose, and ultimate responsibility. The writing pushes us to face our own expectations about moral results while challenging us to express better options if we discover its answers insufficient. The ancient papyrus keeps falling apart, yet the matters it brings up stay as pressing today as they were 1700 years ago. We might have altered our language and improved our classifications. Yet, we have not escaped the human requirement to believe that our choices have importance, that fairness will finally win out, and that the universe holds a moral framework that provides purpose to our struggles between good and evil. In this way, the forbidden door that the Apocalypse of Peter opened will stay open as long as human beings keep asking whether anything we do actually has importance in the